Hello, hello. Can you hear me okay?
Hey, good morning, Jamal.
Good morning. How's it going, man?
Good, good, good. Didn't get him yet. Guys, yeah, gonna wait on Cameron to send that over. One minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines. Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more across our country as well as across the surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Hope everybody is having a good morning. I want to revisit something I said right at the beginning of yesterday's show and sort of correct my correction there. We will be off Monday. So giving people heads up, it's a little bit late at this point, but hey, if you listen to the show regularly, this is as good a time as any. And of course, we will be reminding you throughout the show. We're going to be off Monday. Monday is President's Day. And therefore it's a federal holiday. We're not going to be on the air. Just giving you a heads up, fair notice. We'll be back on Tuesday. Should be a great show then too. And I hope you all have a pleasant long weekend. I'm planning on doing so myself. With that out of the way, hope everybody's having a good morning. Let's get into headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 3,878 new coronavirus deaths and over 105,000 new cases were reported in the United States on February 11th. That is a streak breaker. We'd had 4 days in a row of under 100,000 new cases, and we just broke that yesterday. So for today, 105,515 new cases. Again, I was making this point earlier in the week. It's no longer the case, sadly, but for a couple of days there, we had less new cases per day than we had had in any day since October. So, months ago at this point. Over the past week, however, the average has been going down. There's been an average of 101,655 cases per day. That's a decrease of 36% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And the last 2 weeks have been like that, with averages lower than the weeks preceding them by about that same 30-ish% mark. As of this morning, more than 27,433,900 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 475,000 have died from it. Again, even though case numbers are going down, deaths are still damn high. 3,878 new deaths is another 9/11 and then some. Just trying to put that in context. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on Wednesday, for the first time, updated guidelines for individuals who have been fully vaccinated to state they no longer have to quarantine after being exposed to someone with COVID-19. So if you get a vaccine, you don't have to quarantine effectively, and they've now said that officially. The city of San Francisco filed an emergency court order on Thursday in an effort to force its public schools to open their doors for in-person instruction. This, of course, is evocative of the recent dispute we saw in Chicago between Mayor Lori Lightfoot, the Chicago public school system, and the Chicago Teachers Union, which ended earlier this week with an agreement that appeared to satisfy all parties with a sort of phased return to schools for pre-K and elementary school kids. And as far as I can tell, they still hadn't decided on what to do with the high schoolers. But that's often something that people wonder in our society. Andrew Cuomo, New York governor, is scheduled to travel to Washington today for a planned meeting with President Biden over the federal American Rescue Plan for dealing with the coronavirus. The White House visit, Cuomo's first since Biden took office on January 20th, comes as Cuomo faces growing scrutiny in New York over his handling over the coronavirus, specifically his administration's coronavirus safety measures for the state's nursing homes. On Thursday, Cuomo faced a bombshell report by the New York Post that said a Cuomo aide had told New York Democrats that the Cuomo administration allegedly hid data on nursing home deaths in a bid to avoid scrutiny by former President Donald Trump's Justice Department. Now, this is particularly notable because they were blaming Trump's not the Justice Department, but blaming Trump's White House, his administration, for giving them the directives that, at least in part, led to these deaths, where they would take patients out of nursing homes. They would take elderly people who got sick with COVID out of nursing homes. They'd put them in hospitals, and then they would return them to the nursing homes, as they were recovering from the coronavirus, but before they were ostensibly past the period in which they'd be spreading it. And so they would spread the coronavirus when they were returning to the nursing homes, getting more people sick, repeating the process, and getting a lot of people killed. Where, again, the big bombshell that came out on this was that a couple of weeks ago, Letitia James, New York's Attorney General, came out and said that the actual deaths in nursing homes was 50% higher than had been previously stated. But I just want to single this out. The new report from the New York Post is making it about how Cuomo's administration basically want to hide their misfeasance basically from the Trump administration, while they were publicly blaming them for the policy that they implemented that got people killed. Does that make sense, Jamil?
Of course it does. Cuomo was trying to spread blame around. He's trying to avoid blame. You know, Republicans are calling for an investigation into this, by the way. Shane?
Absolutely. Pardon me. I was taking a breath there to drink some coffee.
My bad.
It came back.
My bad.
You're good. That makes perfect sense, and they should be, and frankly, the Democrats should be too. And I mean, Cuomo needs to take responsibility. He needs to fess up to this stuff. He's not going to. I misspoke earlier. I used the word security when I should have said scrutiny, and I corrected myself, of course. But maybe that was a Freudian slip, because he is remarkably insecure politically. We've had Ted Rall on to say, you know, it's a Democrat state. He has a stranglehold on the political system. So unless his approval dips down to like 30-something%, which is pretty low, then he's not really going to face contenders. Having said that, he's bungled this. New Yorkers seem to be getting pissed, and they're confused about what the leadership wants from them. That is, by the way, a sign of bad leadership. Sort of push back on Cuomo's long-term claims that he is a good leader. Anyway, we got other stuff to talk about. More than $50 billion in funding is on its way to New York State as part of President Biden's enormous $1.9 trillion coronavirus rescue package. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi notified New York's Democratic delegation of the generous package in a letter Thursday, where she said she believed the bill would pass by the end of February, as Congress uses the drastic budget reconciliation route to approve the legislation without Republican support. Drastic is a funny word for this, but I move on. The bailout includes $12.6 billion in New York State coronavirus recovery funding and $10.64 billion for local governments. Another $12.3 billion has been earmarked for the state's shuttered schools, while the Empire State's rundown transit system would receive an $8.8 billion infusion. New York airports are earmarked for $418 million in the aid bill, and small businesses will be eligible for a pot of $483 million. I wonder how much of that $483 million will actually go to truly small businesses, but we'll have to see. Days after taking office, President Joe Biden said his administration planned to buy another 200 million COVID-19 vaccine doses, 100 million from Pfizer and 100 million from Moderna. That purchase went through yesterday, marking a 50% increase in the nation's total vaccine supply. The U.S. has now ordered 600 million total doses from the companies, enough to vaccinate 300 million Americans. That's most of us. That gives the country enough doses for all of its adult population, about 255 million people, and then some spares, I guess. I don't know, but, you know, for the kids, you know, and then for animals, possibly, if we start to get a lot extra. I kid. The new supply won't be delivered until the end of July, meaning it will help prevent vaccine shortages down the road, but won't accelerate the pace of vaccinations. In national political news, a trio of Republican senators allied with former President Donald Trump met with his defense team Thursday evening in the middle of an impeachment trial in which they will vote on whether to convict Trump and potentially bar him from holding public office again. Senators Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, Ted Cruz of Texas, Mike Lee of Utah were spotted going into the room in the U.S. Capitol that Trump's lawyers were using to prepare for their arguments. Trump lawyer David Schoen said that these senators were very friendly guys, quote unquote, who just wanted to make sure they were familiar with procedure on the eve of their rebuttal to the House impeachment manager's presentation. When asked if it's appropriate to meet with senators during the trial, Schoen said, "Oh yeah, I think that's the practice of impeachment," quote, end quote. It's interesting, you know, you'd assume Ted Cruz would be doing this kind of thing. It's interesting to see Lindsey Graham going into that room too. I had always paired him up with Mitch McConnell as one of those dudes whose support for Trump was lagging and a bit forced, but I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's just trying to keep that image up, and maybe there's something there. What's your take on that, Jamil?
Yeah, Lindsey Graham. Look, you have an effeminate senator from the South. Now, I'm not saying that as a negative. I'm just saying someone as a flat fact is. You can hear Lindsey Graham talk. You can look at Lindsey Graham act. I'm not saying any gay jokes or nothing like that. I'm just saying he's an effeminate senator from the South. That senator has to find a way to get in office. That senator nearly lost to a black man in that last election. And it was thought that he was going to lose to a black man in that last election. Lindsey Graham is a vulnerable senator. And as such, he is not going to do anything in the world to trespass against Trump. He is going to be Trump's ace boo-coon from here on out for the rest of his career. He is going to be loving Trump. If Trump said, Lindsey, I need a foot massage, Lindsey will be there to give that foot massage.
Does that make a political career though at this point? Like, is Trump still the deciding factor?
Yes.
Is he still the iron grid to which you should be aligning yourself as a little filing? Like, is he the one who sets the day here?
Yes.
Really?
It depends, right? But think about it. If Donald Trump decides he's going to form a new political party, and by the way, my uncle in Florida is basically saying Trump is talking about forming a political party. What happens to the Republican Party after that? And think about it. Is he spiteful enough to do that? He has nothing else to do with his time. He has nothing else to do with his time. Why wouldn't he? He's angry at Lindsey Graham. He's angry at the Republicans. He's angry at him because he feels like they cheated him or that they wouldn't stand up for him.
Very well could be.
Yeah, he would break
great.
He could break them in half.
Would be a
honestly. So
what would be wonderful, and we got a bunch more headlines, but oh man, we should probably come back to this. But it's just as a little dream here. So Trump creates his own political party that splits the Republican Party. You have a bunch of progressives who are currently relatively pissed about the Biden administration. Say they stay pissed, and in a couple of years, you see some attempts at a breakup of the Democratic Party. Too, you might actually all of a sudden have a multi-party system, and we'd have to figure out the ways in which that would work. And maybe that is a pipe dream. I don't know. Any brief take on that, Jamarl?
And that's not a pipe dream. I mean, look, to me, in my mind, you get this inflection point at some point where the old order just doesn't work. And whether that's a political party that appropriates, the qualities of something else. But the reality of it is, if you remember, when they were trying to get Bernie Sanders to run, Nick Brown's thought was you need a huge luminary in order to drag people away from the political party where you can break it and split it in a way where it can't function, where it can't win, where it can't do anything. And hopefully with the thought of you kill the other party. One has to live, trial by combat, right? And so if Trump does that, is he a luminary enough to do that? I mean, how many people does he need? If you get 30% going to Trump, and by the way, a lot of people are anti-war.
That kills the Republicans.
Yeah, a lot of people are anti-war. A lot of people are sick of it. A lot of people will be okay for $10 an hour minimum wage, meaning despite the populist nonsense that Trump was talking about, if you have somebody who's relatively competent, you actually may be able to pull people with a decent platform. So, yeah, it could kill the Republican Party.
Trump would be a spoiler, or whoever the Republicans are running would be a spoiler. If like you're saying, Trump creates a new party and he manages to get more than 50% of the vote, then the whole tide turns and everything changes. But I don't want a Trump. I want a Trump political party if that leads to a multi-party system in a real sense. But I don't want craziness, and I see a lot of craziness coming out of Trump's camp, and a large part of it coming from Trump himself. But hey, we got more headlines. I want to get to them. Biden's administration plans to expand grants from the Department of Homeland Security to study and try to prevent domestic violent extremism as a part of a department-wide effort to make combating the kind of violence seen last month at the U.S. Capitol a quote-unquote top priority. We have successfully advocated for additional funds. We intend to keep building on preventing domestic terrorism department-wide, end quote, one of the officials said. The new grants would expand on those funded at the end of the Trump administration by the DHS's Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, which included over $500,000 for a project at American University that studies the, quote, growing threat of violent white supremacist extremist disinformation, end quote. The program is aimed at preventing spread of the disinformation through what researchers called, quote, attitudinal inoculation, end quote. That's one of those scary sounding vague phrases that are hard to say. Attitudinal inoculation. They just are talking, they're talking about setting you straight. They're talking about changing your preferences about things in advance so that people have the right concerns about these groups and they're less liable to join them or whatever. But is that really is that really how democracy should work? Anyway, I'm going to skip forward a bit because there's one other big headline that I want to make damn sure we get in this morning. In international news, Russia is prepared to cut ties with the European Union if the EU imposes new sanctions amid a dispute over the treatment of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. That's according to the nation's top diplomat, Sergei Lavrov, saying this today, Friday, in response to a question on Moscow's willingness to rupture formal relations with the EU. Former Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said in televised remarks that Russia doesn't want to be isolated, but is ready to retaliate if the EU action hurts its economy. In my opinion, this is the biggest news of the day, the biggest news of the week. This is the biggest news in a little while here. If you look at it in a sort of grand historic geopolitical sense, if they were to go forward with this, that would be a massive move internationally. Yeah, there are only so many big powers in the world at this point, and Russia and the EU are clearly one of them. So Russia is signaling to the EU through this that if the EU decides to go forward with its sanctions, and specifically, I know that Josep Borrell was mulling Magnitsky-style sanctions, but Magnitsky sanctions specifically against the people who he said were responsible for Alexei Navalny's poisoning his jailing. If he goes forward with this, if they try to push for sanctions, Russia is now saying that they will respond. Now, he might be referring to other sanctions than those, but I'm pretty sure he's referring to the sanctions that Borrell is referring to. And we'll come back to this later on in the show with Mark Sloboda. I just wanted to highlight that because that is significant news. That's big news. But we got to go into a break. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with our soapbox segment, hearing from Jamarl Thomas in his monologue and getting into a short conversation. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
We actually let them expand on their views.
what's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I got to be honest, there were 3 different ideas that we could have had this conversation on today, and I would have been perfectly emphatic in each and every last one of them. I think I want to go with this one, though, because I think this is the one that is taking place right now, and we're going to get to the other conversation on Trump a little bit later. Look, the conversation we're going to have later on Trump is about, basically, Trump is being erased. And in a show of smash mouth politics that is rare, it's as if the Democrats has found a thing that they themselves all agree on, that they hate from flesh to bone, hate in a way where people would say you get a pass on killing Nazis. It seems that they have found their white will, and they're going after that white will. Not just going after that white will, they're taking every opportunity to eliminate and erase him. Believe it or not, I am often the one that is perfectly on board for this notion of smash mouth politics and hard politics and using leverage and using your political skill or whatever you have at your disposal to go after your opponent, especially if it's for good reasons, and especially if you're working on the side of the angels. I have no doubt in my mind that these guys are working on the side of the angels, meaning I don't believe that in the least. Whether you think it's theatrics, whether you think it's not, whatever you want to think of it, it is indeed smash mouth politics. Joe Biden, the anti-Trump, he is an inert substance. Where Trump was frenetic energy and all over the place and has everything, tweeting and everything else, Joe Biden is air. He's a puff of smoke. It's as if you didn't even know he was there. And yet, he is there. Inert. Just there. And so inert that all of the other things are basically taking up all the air in the room. So impeachment, COVID, all of these other things, and yet we have a new president. And that president is just there. Puff of smoke. Despite being a puff of smoke, Joe Biden has hired a team of people, kids probably, with stamp that has rescind on the stamp. And they have every piece of paper that Donald Trump has ever touched. And they're going to hit that stamp and say, rescind, rescind, rescind. Everything that Donald Trump has ever touched, everything that Donald Trump has ever looked at, every room that Donald Trump has gone in, they will have people fumigating. They will have people writing rescind on those documents. And Joe Biden, inert, puff of smoke, will be there with a grandfatherly grin, addressing the American public, telling them it's okay. It was an anomaly. He is going away now. And Grandpa Joe is here, inert president. On some level, this is what Joe Biden said he was going to do. He did, when he ran the contest, was away from it all. If you remember, Joe Biden really didn't engage until it got to the point where Joe Biden looked like he was going to lose. Up to that point, he was above it all. He didn't want to engage. He didn't want to attack. He didn't want to do anything else. On Joe Biden's behalf, though, was a huge media platform that was attacking pretty much all of his other candidates that allowed Joe Biden to basically somewhat be above it all. Joe Biden could attack. Media didn't take any issue with the attack. Joe Biden could be cognitively challenged. Media didn't necessarily bring that up. In fact, they would say it's impolite to bring up the fact that the president of the United States should be competent. That was besides, that was too far. No, he had a helping hand all the way through this contest, even at the very end when social media refused to bring up the Hunter Biden stuff, despite the fact that Hunter Biden was under an investigation. I'm making a point that Joe Biden got into this thinking to himself, I am not going to be pretty much anything heavy or anything else. I just want to be not Trump. Now, for the Democrat side, they're not taking it that way. Whereas the political part, Biden is basically erasing him from the legislative record. Democrats are trying to erase him in full. And this means impeaching him to ensure that he can never come back. This is showing all of the footage. And honestly, I have no issue with this. This is politics. This is smash mouth politics. This is what politics on some level looks like when you have an adversarial process and one of those guys, one of the people in the adversarial process decides to turn over the game. It is astonishing to me that people are utterly shocked by it. That the thought that a president screaming belligerently into a mic to 40 million people that the election was stolen. It's been stolen, they're stealing the election, they're overturning democracy. That doing that to 40 million people, that some percentage of bitter enders would show up actually believing it, actually angry, actually trying to take back America. And in doing so, there's violence. Do people think that I was a wizard? Did you guys think I had a time machine that I went back in time and said, hey, this is going to be problematic? Why do you think, tell me, why do you think that people in the past didn't touch that rail? Why do you think that rail of the elections themselves are not touched? When John Kerry was in that situation, and it looked like John Kerry had been cheated out of a hire or something, we're going to fight it, to which he immediately backed away from that. When Al Gore was cheated in Florida, and he had the opportunity to do it, what did Gore do? He gavelled down everybody that brought up the issue. Because from the standpoint of our political figures, even Republicans, that is not a rail you touch. They understand that the issue of legitimacy of a particular president matters radically. Understand what I'm telling you. If you get to the situation, think of it like this. Under normal circumstances, there's this magical thing called legitimacy. Two people running a race hate each other, said all sorts of bad things about each other. Their people are attacking each other. But at the end of that, what have I said? The most important aspect of the election on that night is the concession speech. That is the most important thing to take place. Why? Because these two people who've been fighting each other, the leader has to get across to his people that, look, we're all Americans. The border of this fight is America. At the end of the day, that's where the fight stops. That guy won. And I agree that guy won, even though I am very angry and I really want to fight this out. But that guy won. I shake my hand, we get a beer, we go home. It identifies, it gets across to his crowd that nothing nefarious has taken place here. All of us, despite the fact we lost this contest, we're all Americans, we're all part of this nation, it's a fabric, etc., etc., we go home. And even though those people may hate that guy's guts, they still don't necessarily like the fact they lose. They accept the legitimacy of it. That magic, ethereal thing, legitimacy, that is conveyed to the other individual despite the fact that people didn't particularly like that individual. This is something that is radically important in our politics. And it's one of those things, in part and parcel to the reason they never touch it. They never broach it. They never hit it. Donald Trump hit something that was taboo in and of itself and went from taboo to basically ripping through, trying to destroy the shreds and bonds of this country. If a president gets to the point of thinking about calling martial law because the communists were working with a dead Hugo Chavez in order to overturn their election, I'm going to say that guy is lying through his teeth, and I'm going to say he's looking for a reason to do something. You cannot. Free speech, I'm sorry, it's not an infinite defense. And in that sense, there is something to be said about whether the president believed what he was saying. And that matters. It especially matters if the president is going to stoke an insurrection. I wasn't a wizard. I didn't have magical powers. None of that. It's just that it is perfectly and clearly understood that if you're telling all of these people that the election is stolen, they're going to respond. The Democrats are trying to erase them for it. And on top of that, what's more interesting is what happens after. Whether they impeach Trump or not, what is going to happen is that various states are going to try to throw Trump in prison, be it Georgia or be it New York. Their objective, their goal is to get rid of him. And personally, I have no issue with this. One last point, and I'm going to end it. For the Republicans who are looking at this, thinking to themselves, yeah, still Trump. Do you realize that the news came out the other day that Donald Trump knew Pence was in danger? And on top of knowing Pence was in danger, still put out those tweets attacking Pence as they raided the Capitol. And these guys were screaming for Pence's head as they were going into the election chamber. Pence stood by Trump the entire way through. And Trump threw him under the bus in a heartbeat, even when his life was potentially at risk. That's the guy that all of these people are throwing themselves on the fire for. Honestly, Trump should have been impeached when 400,000 people died from COVID. But because Democrats went through that first stupid impeachment, they didn't have the political capital to do it. I am perfectly okay with this. They are trying to erase him. This is smash mouth politics. And honestly, he's earned it. Shane, what are your thoughts?
Here's the thing, man. I mean, you're talking about how you're associating with Trump with martial law, but Trump is not the one who put all the barbed wire up outside the Capitol building. And it's not Trump's party that's calling for it to be removed. With just within the last day, 42 GOP lawmakers pushing for barbed wire around the Capitol building to be removed. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think the 25-to-1 ratio of National Guardsmen to attendees of the inauguration back on January 20th, I don't think that was necessary. That's what looks like martial law to me. None of this other stuff looked like martial law. January 6th did not look anything like martial law. It was literally like the inverse of it, where you had an undersupply of police and an oversupply of angry members of the public. We've been over the free speech arguments on this stuff yesterday. I'm worried that if we try to prosecute Trump for saying things, that we're going to give ourselves a precedent that we will then abuse. I don't think the Supreme Court would go for it. But that's, I would say, what this is at heart. I want to come back to that. We only have so much time, but I also, of course, want to add, I disagree with the arguments that Trump was making about election fraud. While there could have been some better arguments he could have made, I don't know. The ones that he was making about the Dominion servers and Hugo Chavez and stuff, along with Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, et cetera, were ridiculous, in my opinion.
Answer me something, Shane. How did I know? How did we know that this was going to happen? Because we predicted this like a month ago.
Well, which part of it specifically are you talking about? The barbed wire stuff or what?
That was going to be a violence as a result of Donald Trump screaming that the election was stolen. How do we know?
Because there's this long-term decline in our political system, and all of our political leaders seem to be bent on weaponizing it in order to achieve their own political aims, Trump included in particularly. But when I say weaponize...
But that doesn't mean there would be violence. That's not necessarily meaning there would be violence. I'm saying, how did we know? Literally, we called us. We said there would be violence.
We'd literally just had a long summer full of violence. In that respect, it wasn't that hard to tell. You'd had a long summer with multiple months of like occupations of public squares and beatings and back and forth militias on the left and the right fighting in the streets. In that capacity, this is all pretty easy to foresee. I'm not going to give us too much credit for this. I think anybody with eyes to see can see that it's not magically going to disappear just because Biden won the election or just because Biden is now in the White House. This stuff continues. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And I don't mean that literally, but if you use these tools, they will come back to bite you. That is what they do. Because in some sense, what you're weaponizing is people's minds, their emotions, their attitudes, and those are surprisingly resilient and persistent once you get them going in a certain direction. But I don't like any of it. Anyway, we should come back to this more later in the show when we're talking
just
with
30 seconds answer. What's the issue with the problem of who leads? And why is it that the elections are typically not attacked within the context of the country, and the concession speech is one of the most important things?
I think they are. Wasn't 2016 a long string of attacks on the electoral process and Democrats making the elections be about Russia and Russiagate and the resistance and the creation of this lingering response?
No, it wasn't. I know you think that there's the same thing, but it's not. Democrats attack the minds of the individuals, saying that Russia attacked the minds of the thinking of the people. Trump attacked the electoral system.
Yes.
Exactly. There's a difference. They're saying,
well,
look,
because they're also accusing
both undermine the electoral
Trump
system.
Of attacking
Yes.
the one.
I agree with you.
Yes, but they're accusing Trump of weaponizing people's minds. That's literally what they're accusing him of, is incitement. They're accusing him of ramping up rhetoric. The same tactic was used in both cases. That's the accusation here. Whether it's Russia or Trump, who, by the way, they've tried to tie at the waist, they've tried to make Siamese twins out of. They're accusing them of the same thing. And I wouldn't say they were of the same caliber, the accusations, because, of course, what we didn't see in 2016 was a breach of the Capitol building, which I agree with you is egregious. But it's the same kind of thing. We need to go into a break. Any quick response there, Jamal?
No, that's fine. We can talk about it later in the impeachment one.
We'll come back to it. We're going into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break in just a minute, talking with Yakov Shapiro about Israel, the suppression of speech, and more. Be back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. This channel, especially this channel, has been hitting this notion of text censorship pretty heavily. While text censorship has gotten significantly more pernicious, the policy has been in play for decades over the subject of Israel. Israel, as a flat fact, is a nation state. It's a legal fiction like any other. Yet, unlike other nation states, Israel considers itself a Jewish state, giving it the weird distinction of being a apartheid state by definition, and yet stand in the wind screaming their democracy. The problem of grand disingenuity becomes more perpetually disastrous as entities in the West back up Israel in this big lie. In the face of open-air ghettos like where Palestinians are killed, maimed, and imprisoned, when they take the issue of their land being stolen away, heartbreaking scenes of people arguing with soldiers, stealing their property or house, when houses are being bulldozed by, or for that matter, large-scale attacks where bombs are dropped on houses to alert them that larger bombs are coming. I remember in that last attack, Israel killed over 2,000 people, with 80% of the people being killed civilians. If we can't point that out, there's a problem. And therein lies the problem. It is frowned upon to call a spade in this situation. not just frowned upon, there are legal, economic, and political consequences for noting just reality. One of these consequences was basically visited upon a writer from The Guardian. Now, Nathan J. Robertson basically put out a tweet. The tweet was joking, or let's say being a certain sarcastic remark, talking about just the money that we are giving Israel at the same time that we are in the middle of a pandemic, coming up with a paltry bill for our own people in Congress. And this basically got him fired from The Guardian. The tweet was this. He makes the point that says he doesn't necessarily usually gets involved in Twitter, but he just, right here, do you know that the U.S. Congress is not actually allowed to authorize any new spending unless a portion of it's directed towards buying weapons to Israel? It's the law. Now, he made another tweet making the point that he's being sarcastic. It didn't matter. They fired him for this. They fired him for this. And he's on Twitter basically saying, I found out the hard way that you can't have this particular conversation. Joining us is speaker, author, and rabbi Yaakov Shapiro. You can find Yaakov's work on his new podcast at Committing High Reason by Yaakov's books, including The Empty Wagon on Amazon, and you can hear more about his work on his website, committinghighreason.com. Yaakov, welcome to the show.
It is Committing High Reason. Yeah, Rabbi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. That's committinghighreason.com. That's a pun.
Oh, I am
Exactly.
sorry. I'm sorry.
I thought that was hilarious.
Committinghighreason.com. Let me adjust this. I'm sorry. But welcome to the show.
That's why I jumped in. I'm sorry. Sorry for jumping in. I just wanted to say I think that is a hilarious pun. I thought that's great. I checked that out as soon as I saw that this morning.
Yeah, it's and the reason is because that's another pun, is because what people consider treason, especially if you are a non-Zionist Jew, that's actually reasoning. That's really what it is. I was torn between committing high reason or guilty of high reason.
Well,
but
both of them work. Both work
Both of them work
exceedingly well. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you joining us on this. This is appalling, to put it mildly. And in a country that has free speech laws and First Amendment laws, I mean, they've criminalized on some level anti or BDS, which is very strange. I mean, in some cases you had states where people had to give these kind of accolades saying that they wouldn't be a part of BDS. This is in the United States. This is in America. And yeah, people are losing their jobs with just criticism or just jokes on this notion of, hey, we're giving these guys all of this money for weapons. They have health care in that country. We don't. Like, those things seem to just be off the table. Can you give us the great problem with this? I mean, I think the problem on some level is obvious, right? But can you show the hypocrisy of this? And not just the hypocrisy of this, the problem, and not even being able to kind of note reality.
Right. So in one way, it's a much greater problem than it appears to be. And in another way, it's less of a problem in terms of what the employers of this writer did. Let's talk about less of a problem. The reason why they fired him is probably not because of his ideas, but because of the damage to the company that would ensue if they allow writers to do this. In other words, let's say there would be a writer that would come out, I don't know what, against Trump, right? In theory. Happens all the time. And then the Trump supporters would threaten the newspaper or whatever it is with a boycott, call advertisers and tell them not to advertise. And all of this is within their free speech rights. The newspaper, at a certain point in time, will have to make a business decision because, after all, newspapers are businesses. They sell advertisements. Should we inflame our customers like this? Should we allow ourselves to get hurt, our business, our operations, for the sake of this person? Was this a smart business decision to allow this to be printed? That's the problem here. That's one big problem with our entire system and our rules about freedom of speech. While it's true that people have freedom of speech, people also, newspapers, radio stations, we look at them as if they're opinion pieces or they're places where we get our information from and our ideas from, but they're not. They're all businesses, every single one of them. Some of them cater to extreme audiences, and some cater to less extreme audiences. But they're all businesses, and the decisions that they make are all business decisions. And the problem is, it's true, he should not suffer for having written this. The problem is that he submitted this as a service to his employer, as a manifestation, as an expression, as a business task. He did this as a business task. That's why he wrote this, because he's employed by these people and they want to make money, so they employed this guy to help them make money. He was not helping them make money anymore. He's helping them lose money. So now, in a free market, what should they do? That's really what happened over here. And the problem is that just like if you rile people up and you defend, let's assume that Donald Trump was allowed, because of free speech, to say what he said. Let's assume that now, right? Just let's go there, arguendo. So these newspapers or these protesters against this writer are allowed to say that let's boycott this news. If you're allowed to boycott Israel, you could boycott a newspaper. And the newspaper, which is a business, has to make a business decision, just like the boycotting of Israel would force Israel, that's the goal of it, to make a business decision whether it wants to continue its behavior. So that's the problem over here. You can't look at just part of the system that's going on. The process, the procedure is one big thing. And it's not the fault of the newspaper, of the business, for making a business decision. It's the fault of people for being stupid, right? So now we have a problem. It's free speech versus free stupid speech.
But,
in other words,
but Rabbi, this was done on his Twitter account. Like, this wasn't even an article written. Like, this was like, that's worse. That's more chilling. Like, he does. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
If this person, because of his Twitter account, and I wouldn't doubt if this happened, or it certainly could happen, people would start boycotting this paper because they hire this guy. It's unfair. It's wrong. But is it within their free speech rights to say, BDP, boycott, divest against the newspaper, BDS against this paper, because we don't like who they hire? Who's going to stop that? Who's going to say
nobody, because that is a protected action in our country. And I agree with you. It's not a loophole. It should be allowed for, but it's one of these weird problems. And this fits into the cancel culture narrative. We were having a conversation about this the other day, where I would say that this started on a large scale with these boycott actions organized by various civil liberties groups, by the ADL, and by other groups, against media outlets that report on things or in certain ways that they disagree with. But it is extended and metastasized throughout our culture, from journalists doing it, the media doing it and being the recipients of it, to pretty much anybody doing it and anybody being the recipient of it, where we have this weird quasi-Stasi-like system where people are reporting on each other out in the public, despite neither of them being officials in any serious sense, and despite neither of them despite the people they're reporting on not actually committing any crimes. It's just what they're saying. I want to come back to this issue, though. Why would the Guardian get boycotted over this? He's criticizing Israel. I want to hand it to you, because I know you're the expert on this stuff. Why is that specifically? We've only got a couple of minutes on this side of the break, and then we'll bring you back. Why is that specifically worthy of a boycott in some people's minds? Rabbi Shapiro.
The state of Israel it's more than just a Jewish state, as you described. It's a country that's unique in the entire world. It considers itself the Jewish state. The difference between a Jewish state and the Jewish state is this. A Jewish state, let's say there's a Muslim state, for example. It means it runs according to Muslim law, or it wants a majority Muslim, or all of those things. Israel is more than that. It's the Jewish state, which means, according to their 2017 basic law, which is kind of like a part of the Constitution that would be comparable to in USA, Israel is the state of all the Jewish people all over the world, meaning they claim to be my state. They claim to be the state of all the Jews in every country, and not the people who are not Jews in their country. They give them civil rights, but not national rights of self-determination. In Israel, there is no such thing as an Israeli nationality. It is Jewish nationality. There's no state in the world like that. I don't know if there ever was. Imagine if there would be an Arab state or a Muslim state that would claim that it is the state of all Muslims in the world, or let's say a black state, right? Let's say in olden days of the black nationalist movements, right? Marcus Garvey or later Malcolm X. Let's say they would have created a black state, which they wanted to, some of them. But let's say it wouldn't be just a state for black people, but the nation state of the black people. And part of your blackness does not mean just the color of your skin. It means you are a part of the nationality of black people, and we are the state of that nationality.
Rabbi Shapiro, we need to go into a break. We're out of time on this segment. That was a good introduction and a good overview, and it's been a while since we've had you on. And so on the other side, I want to make sure that we have enough time to bring people up to speed, basically, on your general take on this stuff. You're just giving a specific instance of it, and I agree. It's weird, singular, and the idea itself is kind of dangerous because you have a union of ethnic nationalism, religious nationalism, a sort of theocratic bent in strangely, largely, as far as I can tell, atheistic society where Benjamin Netanyahu, from what I know, not a practicing Jew. It's a weird confluence of these things. And you would think that after the 20th century, we would have learned from the ethnic nationalism bit. You would have thought that after all of the religious wars in Europe, specifically, not too far away from the region, we would have learned from the religiosity of it, the theocratic nature of it. But we haven't. We need to go into a break, though. We are joined by Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, whose work you can find on his new podcast at Committing High Reason. That's committinghighreason.com. You can buy his books, including The Empty Wagon, on Amazon. And again, check out his new website, committinghighreason.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
Great job. Even better. Let's get one more, just to be sure.
Are you a young photographer the world needs to know? Bring your images to more eyes through the Andre Stenin contest. Open to both artists and photojournalists, there are dozens of categories to enter and compete for a share of serious prize money. And, more importantly, international recognition of your work. Learn more about how to enter at stenincontest.com. Point, shoot, win.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We are joined by Yaakov Shapiro, speaker, author, and rabbi. We ended up on the conversation speaking basically about Israel's role in the world, and this idea that they are the Jewish state, not just a Jewish state, and the weirdness and the distinction within that. Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, a question that came up just as you were telling that. My wife and I, we visited Israel. I've been to Israel twice. I had the opportunity to be given a tour of Bethlehem by a young Belgian-Palestinian woman who was there, who wanted me basically to see what was going on in the areas outside of basically Jerusalem, etc. When my wife went, we went through the entire, the trip, and she tells me one day, she says, when those soldiers kept getting on the buses, it dawned on me, where did they get this land from? Now, when you're in Israel, they are very hardcore about that notion, and about this notion that we're under threat, we're under siege, everybody is against us, etc., etc. And Donald Trump, they used to love. They would not necessarily like the policies, but they would love Trump because Trump basically gave them everything. It is a weird militaristic culture of sorts. How did you get to be you? Meaning, how did you get to that demarcation point from that particular point of view where you can recognize this as, wait a minute, Palestinians are human beings also, and, Zionism is very close to fascism in the way that we're operating. How did you hit that? And why do others miss that within the context of the society? I mean, because the society is pretty decidedly on one side of this particular conversation.
Very simple. First, I did not get to it through that channel. The people think of Zionism and anti-Zionism in terms of Israel and the Palestinians in the same way that they think of pro-Trump or anti-Trump in terms of his being president, right? The fight between, let's say, him and Biden, the competition between them. But that's not really the case, and that really is the reason why all of this is happening. The fact is that even if there would be no problem with the Palestinians, let's say the Palestinians would, again, arguendo, get their own state and be happy, I would still be against Zionism. Zionism is a identity theft against the Jewish people. It's a self-contradictory, irrational ideology. It's an ideology, and it's not just a movement of colonization. That's not true. A lot of people don't understand this, and that's what causes the problem. Zionism is a identity. It's when they call themselves Jews, their definition of Jew is different than the classic definition of Jew. It was a forging of a new identity. What happened was quick 30-second history of this, but it should take 30 hours. Once upon a time, the definition of a Jew was totally religious. It meant somebody who was deputized by God at Mount Sinai into having the obligation of fulfilling the 613 commandments. Non-Jews have 7 commandments. Jews have 613. If you were obligated to fulfill those commandments, you are a Jew. If not, not. Very simple. Now, what happened was that during the Emancipation, during the Enlightenment, the Jews had an opportunity to leave the ghetto and not even be religious anymore, to join the professions, doctors, lawyers, things like that. Until then, they weren't allowed to do so. Many of them chose the opportunity, and they actually assimilated. That's their choice. What problem is that they thought that by doing so, they wouldn't be persecuted anymore. They thought that the personality of the religious Jew is why Jews are oppressed and persecuted. The problem was, especially in Russia in 1881, there were pogroms against all Jews, including the educated, non-religious, non-observant, in those days what would pass for progressive Jews. And now these guys were stuck between a rock and a hard place. We don't want to be Jews, they said, but if we're not Jews, why are we being persecuted as Jews? So they had an identity of Jews foisted upon them by lethal pogroms and various methods of anti-Semitism. And therefore, what they did was they took the strongest political movement of the 1800s when all of this took place, meaning nationalism, and they said, look, if you guys don't want us to be one of your nations, we're going to be our own nation. And once we become a nation, like the people in the Balkans, like everybody who's becoming nations, then we will get respect. And then we will not be like the ugly, decrepit, disgusting religious Jew, ghetto Jew. We're going to be new. We're going to have Nobel Prize winners and Olympic winners, and we're not going to be persecuted anymore. We're going to be strong. We'll be able to fight back against the anti-Semites. And so, now if they wanted to, they could have just said, we're the Canaanim. Those were the biblical inhabitants of the Holy Land before the Jews crossed in and took it over. And there was a movement called the Canaanim that wanted to do that. But the predominant ideology in those days was Zionism, which said change the definition of Jew from what I stated above to, no, we're a nationality. The Jew, like the French, like the Spanish, we're a nationality. We're going to have not only a nationality like the Kurds are a nationality, but unlike the Kurds, we're going to have our own state. And we're going to have the France of the French. We'll be the French, for example, like by way of analogy, and this country will be France. And any Jew in the world, by definition, will mean a national of our country. And then we'll be normal. Our personalities will be normal. We're going to be good people. We're going to be normal people. We're going to be liked. Finally, there won't be anti-Semitism. And not only that, but we will have removed the reason for anti-Semitism. And the reason for anti-Semitism is that they actually agreed with the anti-Semites, that Jews are disgusting. We won't be disgusting anymore. People will love us for our Nobel Prize winners and our Olympic gold medal winners and our Eurovision Song Contest winners. And we're going to make inventions, and we're going to be startup nation. And all the Jews all over the world who are very talented are going to help us, and people will see how great the Jews are. The problem is, it didn't work. It didn't work at all. And after the Holocaust, and a lot of people didn't want this, by the way. Most Jews were not Zionists. After the Holocaust, which was the greatest representation of anti-Semitism and actually xenophobia in the history of the entire world, it was like the most monstrous thing that ever happens, perhaps. And they said, look, Nothing's going to help. The only way things are going to work is for us to just stick to ourselves. And that answers your question that you asked before. Didn't we learn anything from nationalist wars and stuff? The answer is yes, you did. But these Zionists learned or taught or took advantage of the Holocaust to say, what do we have to learn? Nobody's going to help us. Nobody let us in. Nobody did anything for us. So we got to do things for ourselves. And we need our own state. Nobody else can take our state. We need it. And we're an exception to the rule, because look what Hitler did. If these guys want us not to have a state, let them explain why. Nobody was there to help us when Hitler was there. Yes, you want us to be part of the world's nationalities? Fine. And what's going to happen if Hitler comes back? Well, they'll kill another 6 million of us. Will anybody give a darn? No, nobody will. So what choice do we have? There's an expression in Israel, ein brera. There's no choice. This ideology, which is all false, by the way, but it sounds reasonable on its face, is taught to all Zionist kids from when they're children. And this is the second or third generation of them that have been taught this. This is why they have this Holocaust culture. The militant culture there's two reasons for it. Number one, it goes hand in hand with this Holocaust culture. A Pew survey a few years ago found that more Jews said that the most essential part of being Jewish, listen to this, is remembering the Holocaust. It's a complex. It's an obsession with being persecuted. Is there anti-Semitism? Yes. Was there a Holocaust? Yes. Was it unspeakably monstrous? Yes. Yes to all of the above. But that it should become part of your consciousness, the main part of your consciousness, by way of analogy. Imagine that people would say the identity of being black is not merely your skin color. It's being persecuted and being lynched by the white people. And we're going to make lynching centers to remember the lynchings. We don't want to forget lynchings, right? In every black neighborhood that exists, kids are going to take trips down south and see the nooses and stick their heads in the nooses to remember what happened to the black people. And being part of your identity is being persecuted. Now imagine if the black community would be taught that in that way, what type of dark identity that would produce. And being black is obvious what it means. You have a different color skin, nothing else. Very simple. But the question is, what does being a Jew mean? They don't accept the religious definition of Jew because they're not religious, right? Yet they're persecuted for being Jews. So what happened was there was this identity vacuum as to what it means to be a Jew.
Rabbi Shapiro, this is fascinating. You've been giving a riveting history and very clearly and eloquently explained. We only have so much time. I want to thank you for giving us that, and I want to, in our last minute, I want to move to another story that we wanted to get you on, which is ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel and in New York City. But let's come back to Israel because it's happening there in a big way in the last couple of days, last couple of weeks, really. Ultra-Orthodox Jews protesting lockdowns by the Israeli government, coming out in waves of thousands where the streets are black. Just remarkable photography there. Can you please give us, again, we've got 30, 45 seconds at this point. Can you please give us a brief breakdown on your take on this? We should have you back on this sometime. Rabbi Shapiro.
I'm looking at my clock and I'm timing myself at the 45 seconds, 40 of which are left. The short answer is that besides persecuting whoever they persecute, the Zionists hate and persecute the Orthodox Jews too. The police brutality and everything from the beginning of Zionism was horrendous. They actually assassinated a Jew, Jacob Dahan, who before Israel was created wanted to go to the British to tell them the Jewish community does not want a state of Israel. They'd rather stay under the British or the Turks or the Arabs. And the reason they hate them, the Zionists hate the Jews, is because of what I described. The entire goal of Zionism was to create a new Jewish identity and to erase the history and the existence of Haredi Jews. So they are very, very suspicious of anything that the Zionists do that require closing down of their Haredi lifestyle.
15.
That makes perfect sense. Rabbi Shapiro, that was actually a very good response given the time that you had. Thank you so much for joining us. For those listening, that was Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, speaker, author, and rabbi. Check out his new podcast, committingireason.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a short minute with headlines and another 2 hours of today's show.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And that means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 3,878 new coronavirus deaths and 105,515 new cases were reported in the United States on February 11th. Over the past week, there's been an average of 101,655 cases per day, a decrease of 36% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Friday morning, more than 27,433,900 people in the United States have been infected with coronavirus, and 475,000 have died from it. Honestly, if you wanted something to impeach Trump on, it is that. It shouldn't have been that nonsense of that Joe Biden himself was basically guilty of. It should have been that. That is an abominable number. That is a 9/11 nearly every day for like nearly a year. Put it in perspective. And what did we do for 9/11? How much money did we spend? How many materials did we use? How many people did we kill for that? And that number was taking place daily. That is an astonishing number of people to die. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on Wednesday, for the first time, updated the guidelines for individuals who have been fully vaccinated to state they no longer have to quarantine after being exposed to someone with COVID-19. That is big. That is big. The city of San Francisco filed an emergency order on Thursday in an effort to force its public schools to open their doors for in-person instruction. Cuomo is scheduled to travel to Washington today for a planned meeting with President Biden over federal American Rescue Plan for dealing with coronavirus. The White House visit, Cuomo's first since Biden took office January 20th, comes as Cuomo faces growing scrutiny in New York over his handling of the coronavirus, specifically his administration's coronavirus safety measures for the state's nursing homes. On Thursday, Cuomo faced a bombshell report by the New York Post that said a Cuomo aide had told New York Democrats that Cuomo administration allegedly hid data on nursing home deaths in a bid to avoid scrutiny by former President Donald Trump's Justice Department. That has to be investigated. That has to be investigated. And by the way, not just by Republicans. If Democrats have any credibility at all on this very specific issue, they have to be on board for investigating him for that. How is that not a crime? He's basically hiding information on a number of people that his administration was responsible for getting killed by bad and horrible, incompetent choices. Yes, the guy that wrote the book on leadership, potentially hiding information on the number of deaths because he was embarrassed by how high that number was and his own culpability in it. That is a big deal, and that should not be ignored. That is something we've been hitting on this channel for a while. Do other channels bring it up? No. Is it true and is it horrendous? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. The man who wrote the leadership, who sleeps well at night, Governor Cuomo. More than $50 billion in funding is on its way to New York State as part of President Biden's enormous, and I don't think it's enormous, $1.9 trillion coronavirus rescue package. I would even make the argument that that number should be a floor, not a ceiling. That number is not high enough considering you have a pandemic with the number I just read, nearly 500,000 people dead. What did we do with the New Deal? And is 1.9 trillion New Deal-ish? House Speaker Nancy Pelosi notified New York Democrats' delegation a generous package, generous in quotes, in a letter Thursday where she said she believed the bill would pass by the end of February as Congress uses its budget reconciliation route to approve the legislation without Republican support. The bailout includes $12.6 billion in New York State coronavirus recovery funding, $10.64 billion for local governments, another $12.3 billion is earmarked for the state's shuttered schools, while the Empire State's rundown transit system will receive $8.8 billion infusion. New York airports are earmarked for $418 million in the aid bill, and small businesses will be eligible for a pot of $483 million. Shane, I want to bring you in on this. You have been not necessarily skeptical of Medicare for All. You've been more so in the mindset that, look, we need to deal with the medical situation however we deal with it. Medicare for All is a nice idea, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the end all be all if there are other deals that fix this issue in some kind of technical or some kind of other way. So that part. When I see that number, that says 27 million people have been infected with coronavirus, I know that many of those people have symptoms that go beyond just a few months. Many people have mental issues that go beyond a few months, and people with comorbidities basically had a much harder go of it than people without. I look at the number, this is 3,878 people, even today, came down with it. And that number, 475,000 have died. If it is indeed true that the government of the United States has a responsibility to ensure the welfare of the population, it is their job, in writing, it is their job to do that. And you have 475,000 people, 5 people that have died. Is it a failure of that job? And if it is indeed a failure of that job, is not something owed to the American public on some level to balance the scales and get across some level of culpability, complicity, and apology. And apology is not the right word that I'm looking for, but some level of acknowledgement that, yes, we, as the government of the United States, failed monstrously. And the least that we can do is to ensure that there's Medicare for all. It seems that that is the least. Am I insane on this? It seems that that number is directly responsible to the failings of the government. You can say Trump was president, so what? Trump was president of the government of the United States. It's not an individual pursuit. As such, is it not owed? Is it not the least that can be done by the government of this country to ensure that the people of this country are maintained, the welfare of the nation is ensured? What am I wrong on? Or do you agree with it?
My response here will apply generally to anybody who wants to create a sort of large new bureaucracy or large new set of bureaucracies, any large new government organized system for handling some problem or crisis, whatever. My answer here, my response here is going to be pretty much the same across the board. And in my opinion, it's commonsensical. It's the most basic thing in the world. If we're going to do something like that, I want it to be extremely well run. That's really all that I care about. I want the people who set that organization up, set that ball rolling, to be intelligent, to know what they're doing, to have their hands on the reins.
Let's postulate that it is.
To use them well.
Assume that it is.
Then 100%. Then 100%. And I want that, if we have something like that, then I want that to be intensely focused on developing and using new technologies to make medical treatment more cheaper, more effective, more widely available. Frankly, this comes back to the idea, we've had this conversation about universal basic income before, and my response at one point at least was be like, I would rather have universal basic means of production. And that sounds commie for a second. If you're on the right, you're like, well, what is this, dude? Here's what I mean by that. It's localist and populist. I want individual people to be empowered to support themselves across the board. I think that you get a more resilient society that way. If everybody can support themselves, then an economist might say, well, what you don't have quite as much of there is a sort of balance of production. You don't have as much trade. There are problems with that. What I want is, in the event of a crisis, whether it's economic, environmental, whatever, I want people to be able to support themselves. And the same damn thing applies with medical aid. What would be freaking awesome is if at your home, for not that much money, you were able to get treatment for the vast majority of common medical conditions, so that you don't need to go to a doctor, you don't need to waste the bureaucracy's time. And I want the medical system to sort of self-destruct to a certain extent by giving people the ability to treat themselves. I want a technologically advanced society where people live long, live healthy lives. They don't have to pay out pay that much money for it, if any at all. And whatever we can do to get to that point, in my opinion, will be an unmitigated good, all other things aside. That's my sort of comprehensive response on it. Does that make sense, Demerle?
It does make sense, but it makes sense beyond what I was asking. I mean, don't get me wrong, because I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Nobody would. Well, there'll be some Republicans that say, hey, free
Then
speech.
why
and that
isn't
type of
anybody
stuff.
making this point? Why don't we hear this? If nobody would disagree with
No,
this,
you're right. Well, that's why I'm saying.
Can't
Let
that be a
me repeat
unifying
that.
thing?
No person that has any level of empathy would disagree with that. Empathy and good governance, right? Would disagree with that. I guess I'm getting to something a little bit more fundamental, though. If indeed it is the responsibility of the government of the United States to ensure that there's a general welfare provided for, and if it fails monstrously to do that, 27 million people infected, we've become the ground zero for this. And this is a failure for the public. I'm trying to get across this notion that there should be some level of responsibility that is understood by the public that the government has. And in that, if it's not going to provide healthcare and everything else, then at the very least it shouldn't create a situation where the public is just slaughtered by a virus. 500,000 people dead? That's larger than a war. You understand me, right?
And
that's
of course
American
I understand
citizens.
you, but here's the thing. Were the problems that prepared us, that set us up for the way that we dealt with this pandemic, that have cost hundreds of thousands of lives so far, were they caused by the business or government or both? Were they? If you're going to have this, and I'm not saying you're bringing it to this, but if you're going to have this debate, this long-term debate between capitalism and socialism about whether the problems in our society are caused by government negligence, I know, but this is where of course, this is where that conversation.
I didn't bring this
goes.
up. I didn't say squat about capitalism or socialism. You
Well,
could
but
have
here's
had.
why I'm taking in that
You could have
direction.
had President Ham Sandwich. President Ham Sandwich would have did a better
Which
job.
is, by the way, that is Biden's gender identity. President Ham
Look,
Sandwich.
puff of smoke. I keep inert candidate Joe Biden, right? Inert candidate Joe Biden would have said, "I'm going to let the scientists handle it." That's what he would have said. Oh, well, I'm going to let the scientists handle it.
And
don't
in
get me
some
wrong.
cases, in a lot of these cases, they failed. This is where I was going with this. Yes, there are problems with
No, that's
insurance
nonsense.
companies. We've had this conversation
Nonsense.
about Fauci, Jamal. And last I checked, I brought you around.
Nonsense.
At least
This is a
in part,
nonsensical
on the issue of
conversation. The president of the United States is where the buck stops. And you can point to everybody else that you want. This is not about capitalism. This is not about socialism. This is about good governance. And this is about the very basic idea that a president chose, full stop, the economy over individuals and health. Other countries were able to pull us off without having this number of deaths. And look,
this is where I will take the argument. That's exactly the thing. This is about good governance and bad governance. And we have bad governance right now. And that would be why I would be worried about the creation of a Medicare for all plan under what we're talking about, because it would be done by a bad government. And so this comes back to the explicit claim that I was making about, it's common sense.
But you don't know
sort
that.
of tautological.
But you don't know that. Social Security is not done poorly. Social Security is being stolen from, but it's not done poorly. Medicare is not being done poorly. So don't get your argument on this. I mean, you would need to be able to look.
What do you mean
You
it's
can
not being
point
done
to stuff,
poorly?
and you can say the thing that doesn't quite exist might be run poorly. I have no idea. Nobody creates a program thinking to themselves that it's going to be
that's
run
not
poorly.
that's why I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. I'm just saying if it's done, I want it done well. And frankly, I think this would come through. If we're going to make it happen, frankly, it would happen as a part of a larger process of political reform. And all I want is for that when that process goes through, I want to make sure that part of what they're pushing for, part of what's built into it, part of what's extremely important is some process of internal and external evaluation where the people who get put in charge of these things do really good jobs at it. And I want to make sure that that's front and center, because if we can get that, then we'll have a much more functional society on the other side. But I think it's pretty easy to get caught up in broad policy agendas without actually focusing on how they're going to get done or how well they're going to get done, just pushing for something as a goal without making sure it's done well.
Look, my first step, what do you want to do? Second step, how do you do it? That third and fourth step about making sure that thing runs and everything, I got to get it done first. That's the point. And look, from my standpoint, the government of the U.S. has fundamentally failed the public. That number should not have been, look, if that number was 200,000, we would still be complaining, right? It was like, oh, I can't believe the number's 200,000. And Republicans would be attacking whoever. I can't believe she killed all these people. We don't see the sliding door. You're right. By the same token, I do know it did happen. And I do know that we have nearly 500,000 Americans that have lost their lives. We have millions that are dealing with comorbidities and other symptoms that extend beyond it. And all of those people are stuck with a medical bill. All of them. 27-something million people. And so if the government indeed failed, the government has a responsibility for that. I'm sorry, I don't even understand the contrary argument to say that they don't, especially if their job is to provide for the general welfare. And you had a government that basically
But have I made that argument? Or have I made that argument?
No,
or are you
I didn't say
responding
you
to an
did.
imaginary argument?
No, I didn't say you make the contrary argument. No, I'm sorry. I wasn't talking about you. I'm just saying I don't understand the contrary part of the argument. That's all. I'm not saying that you're making that. I'm not doing that. No, I'm just saying, look, for Joe Biden, for the Democratic Party to not push for Medicare for all, after all of these people have died, all of these people have been sick, all of these people have been injured, it is a betrayal. I am sorry. And I don't get this notion that they're pushing through a $1.9 trillion COVID bill and they're saying that Medicare for all is off the table. I just don't get it. It's a pandemic, right? And the fact that the government has failed to such a degree, there should be consequences for that. And the consequences should go to this level of attrition, or this level of, not attrition, but understanding that it failed. We could end the headlines here. I'm just so aggravated with that number and with the paucity of plans and ideas after the fact in dealing with it. And then it's like, yeah, Medicare for all is totally off the table, despite the fact that nearly 28 million people have been infected with the virus. And all of those people basically have medical bills, and nearly 500,000 have died. But yeah, Medicare for all is off the table. Healthcare is off the table. That's appalling. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with Tyler. No, actually, we're going to be back in a moment with another argument. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. There was a video that came out yesterday by one Tucker Carlson. Now, Tucker Carlson has a tendency of bringing all sorts of people on in order to have conversations. Glenn Greenwald, if I'm not mistaken, I think Dorr was on at one point. I even think Cornel West. He is totally open to having convos, and as such, he's gained a certain degree of credibility on the populist aspect of the right, and even by some people on the left who likes to watch his content. That said, Tucker Carlson also has a tendency to be massively and completely disingenuous on a fly. Even at one point where the lawyers for Fox News had to basically say, you can't necessarily believe what Tucker Carlson's saying is reality. So I don't. That said, a lot of people do. So when Tucker Carlson runs a segment, like the segment he just ran, it needs to be discussed. The person who's going to come here to discuss it should be a great conversation. Peter, the tech guy, and Jimmy. He's author of Hail Mary, the Perfect Protestant and Catholic Prayer, and host of Your Prayer Intentions, airing on WQPH 89.3 in Shirley, Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Sunday, noon Eastern. Peter, what's going on, man? You doing all right?
I'm doing all right. Two things. First, the show actually airs on Saturday at noon, not Sunday.
Oh, and I am sorry. I did that. I totally transposed
right.
that in my reading of it. I apologize.
And although I shouldn't be cruel to your Kansas City listeners, I do want to mention an interesting stat. In any given season, Tom Brady is more likely to win a Super Bowl than Pete Rose was to get a hit at any given at-bat. That's frightening.
That is a great stat. I love that. That's a great stat. Look, I grew up in a barbershop, right? Playing chess. So trash talk was always a part of it. Let's do this. Let's go to the video, the Tucker Carlson video, because I got to be honest, I did not like this video. So let's play the clip.
I made it a point to watch it. I had not seen it when it happened. You'll be surprised to hear, I don't really watch Fox. I've reached a point where I don't watch any of the political news story stuff anymore, but I made it a point yesterday before I went to work and this morning to watch the thing in full so that we would be ready for today.
Okay.
And I think his argument...
Wait. Let's play the clip first before you give your argument. Let the audience hear it.
Now you're going to play... Now...
So what does all of this mean exactly? We're not sure what it means, and we're not going to speculate. We do know for certain that the known facts of what happened on January 6th deviate in very important ways from the story they are now telling us, including the story they told us today in the impeachment hearings. And in many places, the known facts bear no resemblance to the story they're telling. They're just flat out lying. There's no question about that. The question is, why would they lie about this? For an answer, think back to last spring. Beginning on Memorial Day, BLM and their sponsors in corporate America completely changed this country. They changed this country more in 5 months than it had changed in the previous 50 years. How'd they do that? They used the sad death of a man called George Floyd to upend our society. Months later, we learned that the story they told us about George Floyd's death was an utter lie. There was no physical evidence that George Floyd was murdered by a cop. The autopsy showed that George Floyd almost certainly died of a drug overdose, fentanyl. But by that point, facts didn't matter. It was too late. Cities had been destroyed, along with the fabric of this country itself. Scores of people had been killed. Democratic partisans used a carefully concocted myth, a lie, to bum rush America into overturning the old order and handing them much more power. It worked flawlessly. So why wouldn't they do it again?
That is a shameful commentary. That is an honest to God. Wait, stop. That is an honest to God, shameful and indefensible commentary. Let's go to the medical examiner's report. The autopsy report from Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office concludes the cause of death was cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement's subdual restraint and neck compression. That conclusion of death due to heart failure differs from the one reached by an independent examiner hired by Floyd, who basically calls it asphyxiation. The point is, they are putting this up for murder because what they realized was if you put a knee on a person's throat for 8 minutes and that person stopped breathing, that the reason a person stopped breathing was because you put a knee on their throat for the 8 minutes. That's the reason why they're charging him with murder. They weren't charging him with murder for kicks. Cops, 99% of cops get off. Out of 1,000 murders a year or killings a year, 99% walk. This was that much more, let's say, problematic because people can watch him scream for his life, scream that he can't breathe. He even got to the point where he screamed for his mom, a grown man. Why would a grown man scream for his mom? It's because he knew he was on the brink of death because that cop had his knee on his throat and he didn't care. For Tucker Carlson to make the argument that it was the fentanyl in the system that was the cause, that is not what the medical examiner is saying was the cause of death. Tucker Carlson made that up out of whole cloth. That is a shameful commentary. Now, Peter, are you going to defend that commentary?
The only problem with his shameful commentary is that it has the virtue of being true. And in fact, if you look at and you're talking about, in fact, what he has been talking about has a long history in America. For example, the first reports of the Boston Massacre were propaganda. The famous Paul Revere engravings showing the British shooting down innocent Americans, and then of course
we are not talking about a random case that took place in the 1700s. We are talking about something very specific that took place that all of the people across the United States saw with their own eyes, and the medical examiner has basically called a murder. So what is Tucker Carlson using for this? This is not about stuff that took place in forever. I'm talking about this very specific case.
As a black man, you should also appreciate this. During Jim Crow, over and over, black men were accused of crimes in the South, especially when it came to molesting women or something like that, on very little evidence or no evidence. And the story was put out, and people were oppressed because
Peter, are you serious? Are you being serious with me right now? Are you being serious with me? I'm literally reading the autopsy. I'm looking at the autopsy. I have it right here on my screen. I am looking at the autopsy. That is not what Tucker Carlson said. Tucker Carlson is reading something from somewhere else that has nothing to do with the autopsy. What is he talking about?
As I recall, the autopsy report, I happen to have a story up written by Robert Stacy McCain, who's a friend of mine, who talks about the George Floyd toxicology report. And not only does he write about the George Floyd toxicology report, and this is a piece that was written back, this is from the American Spectator from August 6th.
Peter, I accept that he had fentanyl in his system. I accept that he had marijuana in his system. I don't care. If you test me now, I may have marijuana in my system. Who knows? I am making the point that that is not the thing that killed him. He was functional. He was active. He was moving about his way before, up until the point where the cop put his knee on his throat. Up until 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 8 minutes. Are you serious? Are you seriously telling me that if a man put his knee on your throat, a grown man with significant intent, put his knee on your throat for 9 minutes, that if you drop dead,
he was going to go into a story. He was going to go into. He was going to go into something.
I'm sorry. It's just the things that he's going into, they'll have nothing to do with the medical examiner's report. And I'm being very specific what I'm asking you. Tucker Carlson said something that just wasn't true. It wasn't based on what the medical examiner said.
Pete hasn't been able to say it yet. I don't know what he's going to go into. I haven't read the article that he's talking about.
Well, let me do a favor before we go any further. Let me take the article I'm talking about and let me tweet it out so that you and your listeners can take a look at it. In fact, let me reply to your tweet with the article I'm talking about. That way you can see it and you can read it for yourself concerning it, because it talks about not only the toxicology report on George Floyd, but it talks about the exchanges that went on before the segment that you've seen, and the comparison Tucker Carlson was making was apt. And I think it's very interesting that you're jumping on that comparison, because it's a lot easier to jump on that comparison than to deal with the point he's actually making, which is that the January 6th business was hyped and a false narrative was advanced for a particular reason. And he used the George Floyd thing as the example of that. And of course, this is something, and the George Floyd story was, in effect, a local story that was promoted. And I live in a town called Fitchburg, Massachusetts. 2 towns away, there's a city called Lunenburg. And 8 years ago, there was a big race scandal out of the high school concerning graffiti put on a young black football player. He's a young kid who actually ended up playing on the varsity team because he was that good. That was put on the house. It was a huge national story. The FBI got involved. The Obama administration got involved. They were forced to have all kinds of diversity things and mea culpas and the like, until it turned out that when the investigation took place, it seemed that the mother had actually put this stuff on. And of course, there was nobody, the story was no longer a national story.
That happens. I hear what you're saying. That kind of thing happens where early on reporting comes out that misreports on the story or that misrepresents it crucially, and then it isn't addressed properly after that story is broken. And so essentially you get a mass set of lies that are propagated. But I want to come back to the subject here. In the article, I'm reading through it. One of the key points that he makes high up is that George Floyd had been saying he couldn't breathe before the police restrained him on the ground when they were interacting with him. But my response to that, and admittedly, that in some sense you can make the point that he was already suffering from this distress, et cetera. The cops had nothing to do with it. But why would the cops put their knee on his neck?
Throat?
Exactly. Isn't that more reason for them to not do that? I mean, that's the exact wrong thing. That's the wrong place to apply pressure. You're cutting off the blood flow. You're further restricting the ability of oxygen to get to their brain. That kind of thing.
Unfortunately, according to the manual, and remember that you had 3 officers there, 2 of them rookies, and 1 the veteran police officer, who's the one currently. I think is he still currently charged with second-degree murder, or is it?
They've dropped. no third-degree murder charges. They dropped that. It was a weaker charge, yes.
Right. So, but under the rules, that was considered an acceptable way of restraining. And
well, thankfully, you led with unfortunately, because it shouldn't be.
It was a smart rule. That was part of this is an acceptable way of restraining a person. Whether that should have been is another debate.
Peter.
That's why the other two cops did nothing, because this is the veteran. He knows what he's doing.
He's a human being. It's a human being. Peter, he's a human being. And it's a human being who kept saying, I could not breathe. And for 9 minutes, he stood on his throat. My point here is that Tucker Carlson is arguing that a noble lie was developed by George Floyd. But in him arguing that, he is basically creating an unnoble lie himself. The fact of the matter is, the medical examiner's report was very clear. Tucker Carlson, what he said here has no association with reality at all. And what you have to deal with is that man, by your document, had a difficult time breathing before the cop put his knee on his throat for 9 minutes. So I don't understand. I need you to justify to me how Tucker Carlson, what he's saying, lines up with the medical examiner's report. Because if it doesn't, Tucker Carlson is lying through his teeth in that monologue. And I'm making the point that he is.
I mean, here's the problem. We're basically out of time. We're already about a minute past our segment, and we've only focused on the claims about the day of the event. What we didn't get to was Tucker's larger claims that BLM and these protests were successful in getting their goal across, which I would also argue is controversial, but frankly could deserve at least its own segment to talk about. But we're basically out of time. Sad to say.
You're great to argue with. You're great to argue with. I appreciate you coming on, man.
Yeah, Pete, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being willing to have this conversation with us.
Have a great rest of the day and a very blessed Lent, which starts next week.
You too. Thanks, man.
Hey, you too. Hey, be well. For those listening, that was the voice of Peter, the tech guy in Gemma. He is the author of Hail Mary, the Perfect Protestant and Catholic Prayer, and the host of Your Prayer Intentions, airing on WQPH 89.3 in Shirley-Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Saturdays at noon Eastern. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're getting into a conversation about what, in my opinion, is one of the biggest news stories this week. And we'll be talking about this more in just a minute. But basically, yesterday, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the Russian Federation was ready to respond to any new severe sanctions by the EU with a break in diplomatic ties with the European Union. This comes after the first meeting between Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign envoy, and Sergei Lavrov, Vladimir Putin in years, the first meeting in a while. And reportedly, and we'll come back to this too, Borrell, the EU's envoy, was basically trounced in those meetings. And that was not received well by the European Union, first and foremost, with over 70 members of the European Parliament calling for Borrell to step down as the foreign envoy. Just a shameful display. Anyway, while this was going on, Russia expelled 3 diplomats from the EU, and I believe they were from Poland, Sweden, and I believe Germany. But I'm going to ask Mark coming on. I'm sure you know this. Please do correct me if I'm wrong about that. I believe it was Germany. Yes, thank you.
Yes, yes, Germany.
Yeah, exactly. For this conversation, to talk about the consequences of this potential break in diplomatic ties, what that would mean, and more, talking also about this meeting, many other subjects we'll get to, we are joined now by Mark Sloboda. For those listening, Mark Sloboda is an international relations and security analyst who you can follow on Twitter at Mark Sloboda1. Mark, thank you for joining us. What do you think about... Appreciate it. What do you think about this interaction? What do you think about what Sergei Lavrov said yesterday? What led to this? Obviously, I haven't even mentioned Navalny. which that's what this is all about. When Borrell went to Russia to meet with them, he was pushing pretty hard on Navalny. That was, as far as I can tell, the main point of contention there, and the main thing that he was bringing up. And this is part of a larger EU pushback against Russia for, first, the alleged poisoning of Navalny, which we've talked about before, of course, as well as more recently the sentencing of Navalny. This is part of a larger process. But let's get back to the actual topic. What would be the consequences? What do you think would justify? What would lead to a break in ties between Russia and the EU? And is this as big a deal as I think it is, as I was making it? Mark.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines. There has already been some walk back. Sergei Lavrov's comments to the Russian media in Russian were widely spread immediately and viewed as a kind of a dramatic escalation in the tone of the discussion from a normally quite calm Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, an extremely experienced foreign minister who has held this position during most of Vladimir Putin's administration as president. And it was almost immediately walked back a little bit by the Russian presidential spokesman for Putin, who said that it's being taken a little bit out of context, and the remarks are specifically if these sanctions are considered highly damaging to the Russian economy. Other than that, Russia is looking to improve relations with the EU. And something that might approximate that, if Europe goes along with U.S. demands to kill the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the U.S. has been sanctioning Russian, German, and other European companies, 6 European energy majors who were involved in the construction of this second gas pipeline going under the Baltic, bringing Russian natural gas, a second pipeline. The U.S. has long wanted it killed for geopolitical reasons, and also so that Europe buys their own twice as expensive liquefied natural gas instead. So that's one thing. Another thing might be is if the EU cooperates with long discussed U.S. pushed plans to cut Russia off from SWIFT, the international payment system. Russia already has a kind of a bare bones substitution ready to be put into place, but it would certainly, do considerable restrictions on Russians' ability to make purchases abroad. It's not even sure how then the Europeans would pay for the gas that they continue to buy from Russia. But these are very high level things. I think that if it was simply another round of individual sanctions against Russian officials deemed to be involved, in what the EU is calling the political persecution or the denial of human rights to Navalny, never mind the criminal case by the French cosmetics firm against him that is at the root of the at least the technical terms of his incarceration. So I think if it's just a matter of personal sanctions and something like that, I'm always amazed that there's still Russian officials that the EU and the US haven't sanctioned yet. And it's kind of regarded as a badge of honor in Russia. It's
is it really?
Type of. It's Russian politicians, openly boast about it. And while it might be restricting to, some of the business elite in the country, as far as the political elite goes, it's something laughable. My God, they can't go to Disneyland. It's not taken as any. It's more for domestic audiences for the U.S. and the EU to express their outrage and to tell their own elites that they're doing something.
Well, this gets to. Let's go into that for the moment. Because the Borrell thing was actually kind of funny to me. It seems like he had circles ran around him, and then afterwards he was, defending himself angrily when people were calling for him to be rescinded. There's one quote here that's great. The scene of Borrell smiling and staying there instead of walking off while Lavrov were saying that we're unreliable was humiliating, the second diplomat said. That quote is great. They even go into this notion that he's like, their concern is basically that he's embarrassed us in front of the new Biden administration. I want to get into that because that seems to be part of this, that the EU wants to be a partner with the United States. By the same token, it seems that the EU's foreign policy has basically been dominated by the United States, even when it is not in their own interests. The pipeline is clearly in Europe's interests. And yet, they're still quibbling back and forth over whether or not they're going to get rid of this thing in the interest of the United States. This is obscene. I mean, even the JCPOA, for example, where you had all of these companies that were supposed to have the sanctions removed, they're supposed to be working with Iran and everything else. The moment that the U.S. puts the sanctions back on, the EU is basically neutered for all intents and purposes. Like, at what point does the EU extricate its foreign policy from the U.S. this closely? And I got to be honest, I thought after the Trump administration, that would be something that they will be more inclined to do. What is going on with this?
Yeah, certainly with the Biden administration in place, that's not going to happen. Europe has very limited foreign policy agency, as seen. Yes, Germany is continuing, to say we're going to at least allow Russia to finish Nord Stream 2, even if no European companies are helping them now. But at the same time, how do they respond to U.S. sanctions against their own companies? They say, we don't think that's constructive, and we wish they wouldn't do that. I mean, that's hardly worthy of the dignity of what you would think is the state of Germany or the other European countries involved. It's pretty
so
classic.
sad.
It's like
that's so sad.
It's like the German response when Merkel discovered that it was announced that Obama was bugging Merkel's cell phone. Okay, United States, they're our hegemonic master. It's pretty pathetic. It's pretty sad, and I don't see them breaking away from it anytime soon. In fact, they're ecstatic that the hegemon is back to normal management and efficiency as they see it with Biden. But this EU foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, he came to Moscow, and it's been billed as him extending an olive branch to Russia over the bad Russian EU relations. What exactly was that olive branch? Well, him showing up and speaking, evidently. And he came, and all he wanted to talk about was, of course, this fringe far-right figure they're pushing as the opposition leader in Russia, and with the seemingly full backing of European states and the United States. We've discovered via released video that his close friend and the executive director of his so-called anti-corruption foundation, FPK,
they're royally
was
corrupt.
Caught on tape asking for $10 to $20 million to stage protests and propaganda from a British diplomat and known spy.
Yeah, we have
also
that tape.
Asking for dirt.
Yeah, we have that tape.
Yeah.
That tape was shown on RT. That is a brutal tape. And maybe
the Western press is completely ignoring it.
Yeah, they are. They completely ignore that.
No Western journalists will talk about it.
The press has been
They will not discuss it. They will not respond to it. They completely ignore it because, of course, it reveals Navalny for the Western intelligence asset that he is. So they don't want to acknowledge that video exists.
We have that clip.
Wait,
and so
you said-
I don't know if we have enough time to try to pull that clip from RT, but that would be great if we could pull that clip real quick. But
It is
there's
also-
one
it's a
thing,
little
there's a
bit-
question
the
I want to
audio
get
from
to
it's a
before
little
we
bit
go
more-
to the break. And there's about 30, 45 seconds. Donald Trump had a good point. He asked, how on earth is Russia supposedly an enemy by the same time you guys are getting gas from what you're considering to be an enemy? There seems to be a hypocrisy there that is so bizarre that he nails. Explain that.
Yeah, not only that, of course, Europe gets a significant amount of its energy supply, but so does the U.S. U.S. actually imports 6% of its oil imports come from Russia, the same as it gets from Saudi Arabia. And the United States has a huge trade deficit with Russia, something like $16 billion that the U.S. buys more from Russia than Russia buys from it, despite Obama's, what does Russia make? Rather ignorant and showing what bad Russia advisors he has. But Moscow was inflamed by, these Borrell coming here to berate them over the affairs of a domestic citizen and Russian justice system dealing with the suspended sentence over Navalny's brother's bilking of the French cosmetics firm Yves Rocher in Russia. And when he came here he demanded to see Navalny and everything. And Russia Lavrov was quite unusually in your face. And he started throwing back accusations about Catalan, the harsh repression of the independence movement for Catalan from Spain and the jailing of Catalan rappers and so on. And the EU was just,
Mark,
how dare they?
I'm going to have to take you out, but let's bring you back. We're going to have the conversation about Navalny. I wish we had that clip. But we'll bring you back. The voice that you guys have been listening to is Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst and a good friend of the show. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Yo! So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Merle Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. And we are joined by Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. Mark, I want to come back to this conversation for a minute. We got a lot of other stuff to talk about between Saudi Arabia, Lukashenko, and Belarus, as well as China. But I just want to briefly follow up on this bit about the sanctions. How likely do you think it is that the EU would impose new sanctions significant enough for Russia to respond in this way? Just looking at it in terms of probabilities and possibilities here, what would it take, both for them to do that? You already addressed the level of sanctions that it would take, but how likely do you think that is, and what would get us there? How possible is that, Mark?
I think they will respond with sanctions. They have claimed to be insulted and their foreign policy chief humiliated. There's calls for him to be fired, to resign. And he himself is now calling for sanctions. But I think that they will not be severe sanctions and that Russia will just shrug them off, maybe respond in some type of tit for tat fashion. But it will not be this type of great break yet. I don't think we're at that.
It would be like you were saying. It would be like you were saying the Magnitsky-style sanctions. This is what Borrell was talking about specifically, was Magnitsky Act sanctions, basically cutting off asset rights of Russians in the EU, but specifically those who were involved in the jailing of Navalny. But again, like you were saying, that would be laughed off. I guess here's where I was really going, though. How likely would the EU be to impose the level of sanctions that would justify this kind of diplomatic response from Lavrov and the Russian Federation, really? Mark?
Very, very unlikely. I do not see that happening at this occasion. I think there's still enough, particularly in Germany, they want to see the business community there wants to see this pipeline commuted. They need it for their energy security. And the German foreign minister has recently made, comments that, if, for instance, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was canceled, we would lose all leverage with Russia and it would go completely in China's direction. So it would be a geopolitically strategic wrong decision from a geopolitical perspective. So I think that is extremely unlikely at this point. There's always the possibility of new provocations and citing things further, but I don't think we're at that stage yet.
Okay, we have the tape. And I want to play this tape because this tape is phenomenal. And you're right. The Western media doesn't play this. They don't acknowledge it. They act as if this thing doesn't even exist, which is phenomenal. So this is early 2010. It appears to show a close associate of Alexei Navalny seeking cash and intelligence from an alleged British spy, suggesting his anti-corruption work may benefit the firms in London. Now, Vladimir Ashurkov, an employee of the British Embassy in Moscow. Now, he is an executive director of the FBK, Alexander Navalny's anti-corruption organization. Let's play the clip. I mean, I can quote part of this. Basically, if we had more money, we would expand our team. Of course, he said, adding that the goal was obtaining a little more money, like $10 or $20 million a year, will make a huge difference. And let's play clip.
If we had more money, we would expand our activities, of course, with a little money. If somebody would spend, I don't know, $10, $20 million a year on supporting this, we would see quite different picture. And this is, not a big amount of money for people who have billions at stake in this game. Yeah. So that's the message that I'm trying to project in my fundraising effort and talking to people in the business community and so on. We need to play on different chessboards. Mass protests, civil initiatives, propaganda, establishing contacts with the elite and explaining to them that we are reasonable people and not we're not going to demolish everything and take away their assets, things like that. So we'll see what comes out of that. So this broadly describes what I do.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, not a small job.
Oh, this continues, right? He said,
Yes.
Asherov said, it could use information provided by the British government, particularly the Serious Fraud Office, for its expose. The agency, quote, has access to information that would not be available to us from British sources on certain Russian people. He named businessmen Roman Abramovich, Alisher Yusumanov, who have both assets in the United Kingdom, as examples. This is horrendously corrupt. This is so corrupt. Yeah. And again, like you say, the West acts as if this doesn't exist because they want to keep this image of Navalny as an opposition figure. That's astonishing.
Yeah. Could you imagine if this was one of Trump's closest, the head of one of Trump's organizations, the executive director, because that's what Vladimir Ashurkov is. He's a close friend, and he's the head of Navalny's own so-called anti-corruption foundation. And since this was taped, he has since been given political asylum in the UK, where he is now. And he has been lobbying in the past few days, creating a list of Russian government officials that he, on behalf of Navalny, is demanding that Western governments sanction.
Do you know how screwed up that is? They have Julian Assange in Belmarsh prison.
That's treason.
They have Julian Assange, Belmarsh prison. I'm just pointing out the difference here. They are basically giving him asylum when he is basically doing something radically corrupt. While Assange tried to get asylum and ended up in a Belmarsh prison. I'm just pointing out the difference between those things. Please, Shane, take it. Okay, well, Mark, so from this point on, what happens from here? They gave him asylum. Okay, fair enough. But there's still this thing about Navalny that the West is pushing as if Navalny is a real opposition figure in Russia. Where does this go from here? Are they really going to start pushing further for sanctions and these type of things? I mean, they seem to be pretty strong on the Navalny kick. I mean, meaning they're literally using him. They seem to be using him pretty heavy as a cudgel to go against Russia on issues of human rights. Where does this go? Or does this go anywhere? Is this just this kind of pawn that is thrown out there that doesn't really have any chance of going anywhere, but it's just put out there for the sake of a argumentation? Or is there more to it? Like, is there a reality to this that these guys are trying to push?
Yeah, Navalny's going to be in prison for at least 2.5 years, and there's no way that the Russian government is going to, step into the Russian justice system and relieve him. And there are multiple other cases against Navalny right now, including for defaming and slandering a World War II veteran, which I think is a little overblown. But anyway, I think that Navalny will become, again, the type of perennial, Russia is politically persecuting this, democracy and anti-corruption crusader because Putin is afraid. It's this type of ridiculous rhetoric, and it will be brought up, every time any Western leader speaks to Russia and used to demonize, and will become a kind of standard propaganda point for the next few years. But it's quite clear that Navalny is being pointed and backed by the West as a destabilizing weapon against the Russian government, attempt to delegitimize them. Now, never mind that he only has support of somewhere between 2% and maybe on a good day 5% of the Russian people in the country. The headlines that are generated and the fact that he can draw thousands of people in cities of millions onto the streets, at least provides fodder for Western media, to paint Russia in the type of way, never mind what they do to their own protesters in their own countries. But it will become, a perennial figure, much like the criminal oligarch Khodorkovsky was for years by the West. And as far as I'm concerned, Putin's biggest mistake was letting him out of prison early.
And of course, Biden back in the day was the guy who passed the Senate resolution basically stating support for Khodorkovsky. And so it's interesting to me that hasn't come back up more recently in the new Biden administration, but I'm sure we'll see a return to that rhetoric. I want to change topics here. We only have so much time. I want to talk about Lukashenko and Belarus for a second. Lukashenko, the head of Belarus, won last year's election in what many, including you and I believe we, have said was a pretty apparently, to some degree at least, a rigged election. Extending a couple of decades of power at this point. He's widely called the sort of last dictator in Europe. He's decried by that. And he, like his country, like Ukraine, is a border state between Russia and the EU. And so they are seen as these, key strategic sort of proxy nations, which if from the EU's perspective, if you can drive a wedge between them and Russia, either by hook or by crook, through a coup, or through somehow long-term diplomatic means, which is much, much less basically impossible as far as I can tell with Lukashenko in power, maybe you can get them over onto the EU side. Anyway, coming back to the actual topic, after those elections, massive protests. We'll come back to that. I want to hear from you how massive they actually were. And Lukashenko at this point, those, as far as I can tell, led to nothing other than several awards for their organizer by the EU, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. At this point, Lukashenko has declared victory, calling it a mutiny, saying that the country is saved, that they're on the other side of this. And he is still calling, although laggingly in my opinion, that 1 minute being done on it, calling for a fix to the Constitution, basically reforming the Constitution, promising a referendum to get himself out of power effectively. Did he actually win this one? I mean, clearly he's still in power, but are they on the other side of this, Mark? And when do you see that constitutional reform coming? What's the process for that going to be like? In our last minute here, Mark.
Yeah, he hasn't quite won it yet. Right now, the protests have dwindled with the weather and so on, but he has lost a great deal of legitimacy. And right now, Russia is actually the one pushing him to enact constitutional reform and step down. And He's actually supposed to meet Putin at the end of February, and Putin will push for further integration of the Belarusian Russian Union state, and for him to step down. But I think he's going to try to avoid substantial reform and stepping down in the near future. We'll see how much pressure Russia can leverage on him.
And pressure coming from both the EU and from Russia, which is just interesting to see. In any event, thank you for joining us. That was the voice of Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute with headlines in our last hour this week. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live, coming to you from across the divided states of America. It is time now for the last hour this week of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I want to give people a quick heads up. Hope you're all having a good morning so far. But quick heads up, we're going to be off the air on Monday. It's President's Day. That means we're not on the air. Simple as that. We'll be back on Tuesday, but just wanted to let you know, when you don't hear us, it won't be a surprise. We're not going to be on. It's a federal holiday. Anyway, getting back into the news. First up in COVID news, at least 3,878 new coronavirus deaths and 105,515 new cases of COVID were reported in the United States on February 11th. Over the past week, there has been an average of 101,655 cases per day. That's a decrease of 36% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Friday morning, that's this morning, more than 27,433,900 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 475,000 people have died from it. And a quick note, too, we had 105,000, a bit over that, new cases reported yesterday. That is effectively a streak breaker, where for the previous 4 days, we'd had less than 100,000 new cases. And those were the first days since October in which we'd had less than 100,000 new cases. So winter hit, cold and flu season hit. It hit us hard. A lot of people died. And you know, it's now coming back down, but just giving a little bit of context there. Anyway, moving on. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on Wednesday for the first time updated guidelines for individuals who have been fully vaccinated to state that they no longer have to quarantine after being exposed to someone with COVID-19. The city of San Francisco has filed an emergency court order Thursday in an effort to force its public schools to open their doors for in-person instruction. I'm getting flashbacks from what, the events of the last couple of weeks. In Chicago, between Mayor Lori Lightfoot, the Chicago Public School System, and the Chicago Teachers Union, which were deliberating for weeks over when and how to return to schools. And, they came to an agreement on that earlier this week. We'll see about San Francisco. New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo is scheduled to travel to Washington today for a planned meeting with President Biden over the federal American Rescue Plan for dealing with the coronavirus. The White House visit, Cuomo's first since Biden took office January 20th, comes as Cuomo faces growing scrutiny in New York over his handling of COVID, specifically his administration's coronavirus safety measures for the state's nursing homes. On Thursday, Cuomo faced a bombshell report by the New York Post that said a Cuomo aide had told New York Democrats that the Cuomo administration allegedly hid data on nursing home deaths in a bid to avoid scrutiny by former President Donald Trump's Justice Department. I'm going to point out again, this is insane, because Andrew Cuomo was effectively blaming, his administration was putting the responsibility for their handling of this stuff off onto Trump's administration. They were saying, okay, we received this directive to, when you bring people out of nursing homes, put them in the hospital, we should send them back into the nursing home before they fully recovered, as they were later in the stages of recovery. The point is, though, they would still, in a lot of cases, be circulating, they would still be spreading the coronavirus. So Cuomo's administration pushed the responsibility for this onto Trump's administration, onto the president. And at the same time, according to this New York Post report, an aide has said that they were trying to hide that crime from that very Trump administration. So which is it? And I mean, I don't want to make this about Trump again. Really, this should be about Cuomo, but I think that's the point. Does the buck literally always stop with the president, or are there cases like this one where lower officials are responsible for their domain, whatever, they're responsible for their responsibilities, and they're bucking those responsibilities? I mean, do you see what I'm saying, Jamal?
Cuomo is guilty.
I guess I don't.
Cuomo is guilty as sin. Guilty as sin. I mean, look, you could say that the president has a huge degree of responsibility and latitude within the context of his responsibilities, yes. But so does governors. Governors also matter. Governors are containing the state and whatnot, especially with Cuomo for the state of New York, which because of its size, because of how populated it is, good governance matters that much more. If Cuomo makes a choice, meaning discretion, an opinion, where he is sending people to nursing homes, and those people end up dying en masse in nursing homes. Again, 42% of the deaths took place in 0.6% of the population. That 0.6% nursing homes. The residents, the people who are working there, the people who are janitors and whatnot, and the patients and the doctors and whatnot. And so if Cuomo were sending people there, or forbade people getting tested before and after, and then even defended and protected the companies or whatever to putting in a legal thing to prevent those people from being charged with lawsuits or whatever, and you find he undercut the numbers in order to make himself look better, then writes a book talking about leadership and how awesome and good governance and leadership. No, Cuomo is guilty as sin, especially with this report now saying that they found out that he was lying about the numbers, or that he knowingly downplayed those numbers. He needs to be investigated.
And gets an Emmy. He gets an Emmy, and he was trying to hide that investigation. He was trying to prevent that investigation by hiding this data that New York's Attorney General Letitia James released a couple of weeks ago. It's insane. This is a huge story, and both Cuomo, obviously, but also the media generally need to take responsibility for their laudatory treatment of Andrew Cuomo last summer. And maybe they were trying to make up because they were criticizing him in the spring, albeit haltingly, over the New York City's and New York State's horrible early wave of coronavirus infections that left the city, as far as I can tell, permanently damaged. Left a lot of businesses closed, a lot of people deciding to move out of the city, and lingering impressions of negligence and just poor management. Anyway, that's kind of a topic for another segment. We got a lot more headlines to get to, so I'm going to move on here. But on that point, more than $50 billion in funding is on its way to New York State as part of President Biden's enormous $1.9 trillion coronavirus rescue package. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi notified New York's Democratic delegation of the generous package in a letter Thursday, where she said she believed the bill would pass by the end of February as Congress uses the budget reconciliation route to approve the legislation without Republican support. That bailout includes $12.6 billion in New York State coronavirus recovery funding, $10.64 billion for local governments. Another $12.3 billion has been earmarked for the state's shuttered schools, while the Empire State's rundown transit system would receive an $8.8 billion infusion. New York's airports are earmarked for $418 million in the aid bill, and small businesses will be eligible for a pot of $483 million. Okay, they screwed up. Let's give them more money. That'll go well. I understand that's not all of it, but that's one aspect, certainly. In our next headline, days after taking office, President Joe Biden said his administration planned to buy another 200 million COVID-19 vaccine doses, 100 million from Pfizer and 100 million from Moderna. That purchase went through yesterday, marking a 50% increase in the nation's total vaccine supply. The U.S. has now ordered 600 million total doses from the companies, enough to vaccinate 300 million Americans. That gives the country enough doses for all of its adult population, about 255 million people. The new supply won't be delivered until the end of July, meaning it will help present vaccine shortages down the road, but won't accelerate the pace of vaccinations right now or anytime before that. What it might do is it might make it more possible for people to start giving out the first dose of vaccines instead of, to give the first dose of vaccines to a much larger number of people instead of holding one dose back to basically follow up on the first dose. But that'll only take effect later on in June. because you need to give the second dose not too long after you give the first one. Anyway, enough about that. In national political news, a trio of Republican senators allied with former President Donald Trump met with his defense team Thursday evening in the middle of an impeachment trial in which they will vote on whether to convict Trump and potentially bar him from holding public office again. Specifically, Senators Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, Ted Cruz of Texas, and Mike Lee of Utah were spotted going into a room in the U.S. Capitol that Trump's lawyers were using to prepare for their arguments. Trump lawyer David Schoen said that the senators were very friendly guys, quote unquote, who just wanted to make sure they were familiar with procedure on the eve of their rebuttal to the House impeachment manager's presentation. When asked if it's appropriate to meet with senators during the trial, Schoen said, "Oh yeah, I think that's the practice of impeachment," quote unquote. The Biden administration plans to expand grants from the Department of Homeland Security to study and try to prevent domestic violent extremism as a part of a department-wide effort to make combating the kind of violence seen last month at the U.S. Capitol, quote, a top priority, end quote. I want to come back to that specifically. Quote, we have successfully advocated for additional funds. We intend to keep building on preventing domestic terrorism department-wide, end quote. That's according to one of the officials. Speaking about this, the new grants would expand on those funded at the end of the Trump administration by DHS's Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, which included over $500,000 for a project at American University that studies the, quote, growing threat of violent white supremacist extremist disinformation, end quote. The program is aimed at preventing spread of the disinformation through what researchers call, quote, attitudinal inoculation, end quote. That's an Orwellian turn of phrase, using medical terminology characteristic of vaccines, inoculation, to basically talk about trying to change people's minds on things in advance, I would guess. The fact that they're making this a top priority, for me, is pretty worrying, not because I'm in any way in favor of white supremacist domestic terrorists, but because I'm in favor of the free speech backlash if the government tries to nudge us all in certain directions, tries to suppress speech it doesn't like, etc. The stuff they're setting up here will be used against everyone. And that's why, while I don't want to stand with the, white supremacists or whatever, I don't even really want to stand for them. I do definitely want to stand against the government trying to do this kind of thing. So we'll come back to that, I'm sure. A lot more to talk about. In other headlines, an Alabama inmate on Thursday won a reprieve from a scheduled lethal injection after the U.S. Supreme Court said the state must allow his personal pastor in the death chamber. The lethal injection of Willie B. Smith III was called off by Alabama after justices maintained an injunction issued by the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals saying he could not be executed without his pastor present in chamber. Department of Corrections spokeswoman Samantha Rose said the execution would not proceed given the ruling. In international news, Russia is prepared to cut ties with the European Union if the EU imposes new sanctions, specifically new crippling economic sanctions, amid a dispute over the treatment of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, the nation's top diplomat warned on Friday. In response to a question on Moscow's willingness to rupture formal relations with the EU, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said in televised remarks that Russia doesn't want to be isolated, but is ready to retaliate if any EU action, if a set of sanctions come across from the EU that hurts its economy. And to be clear, to disambiguate this stuff, Borrell and other diplomats, other officials in the EU are talking about a round of Magnitsky-style sanctions, which would basically freeze assets and cut off investment opportunities and travel rights and just various stuff for Russians specifically involved in the jailing of Alexei Navalny. Those would not justify this kind of response. We were talking about this with Mark Sloboda in our last couple of segments from 8:30 on. And what he was saying makes perfect sense. The Russians have tended to laugh off the Magnitsky sanctions. Basically, what are we going to do? Go to Disneyland? No, thank you. I'm fine. That kind of thing. This is not what they're talking about. They're talking about much more serious, crippling economic sanctions, which Mark called an unlikelihood, very unlikely, I think he said, and which I don't see the EU moving for that anytime soon. Anyway, great segments. Go back, check those out. 8:30 if you weren't listening. BBC World News has been banned from airing in China. This according to a statement from China's National Radio and Television Administration, that's the NRTA, on Thursday. The announcement comes 1 week after Ofcom, the British media regulator, said it had withdrawn a license for China Global Television Network, or CGTN, to be broadcast in the United Kingdom. China's NRTA claimed in a statement that BBC World News had broadcast reports on China that, quote, infringed the principles of truthfulness and impartiality in journalism, end quote. I'll be honest, I don't like this, but I really don't like the UK doing it, because you would think, and maybe this is my sort of American bias take, you would think that the UK would stand up a little bit more for free speech than the Chinese would, but they led with this. And then the Chinese did the tit for tat, the Chinese government did the tit for tat, which is surprising and not good for anybody, in my opinion. But hey, that's the situation as it has unfolded.
Just to be clear, they don't have a choice but tit for tat. That's all. What other thing do human beings have at their disposal outside of full-on war? They have tit for tat. They have slow escalation. You do something, I respond. You do something, I respond. You do something, I respond. And it gets to the point where if you continue, meaning if you stop, everybody stops. Everybody's good. But I can't allow you to do something to me without a consequence, because it allows you to act with impunity. And nation states, individuals even, when there are peers, they do not allow that. They can't allow that. The last thing you can do is allow basically yourself to be bullied. China is a much larger nation than the UK at this point. They should not allow it. They will not allow it any more than they will allow the United States to do it. So it's not that it's great, but China is doing what any nation would do, and they say, all right, fine, we'll escalate to it, we'll stop. If the UK stops, it stops.
I hear you. That's the code of Hammurabi style tactic, and I think that Gandhi has had the wise quip, "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind." But having said that, of course, I get what you're saying, and this is an old argument that I don't think we're going to get any progress on. I completely get what you're saying, and I do agree. It's just, oh man, it'd be so good if there were things that you could do to lessen the extremity of the tensions that you're in. It'd be so good if that was what both parties wanted. Because if only one party wants that, of course, then either they make concessions, they don't respond, and they're seen as weak, and it drives the other party to more aggression, or they do respond, and what you get in the long run is an escalation until things break down into either war or some détente. But we got other headlines. I want to get to them before we go to our next guest. These will be brief. In tech news, Facebook and its photo service, Instagram, pulled down more than 1 million pieces of content during the last 3 months of 2020 for containing misinformation about COVID-19 that could lead to, quote, imminent harm, end quote. This content included fake preventative measures for COVID-19, the respiratory illness caused by the novel coronavirus, and exaggerated cures, according to Facebook's Vice President of Integrity, Guy Rosen, speaking Thursday in a press call. I don't like that. I don't like misinformation, but I don't like these authorities judging for us what is misinformation and what isn't, especially when, as we've seen, the authorities can misinform themselves, literally. I mean, they will internally circulate things that are untrue, and then they'll propagate that to the public, although they do the latter a bit more often than the former, I think. Real quick, also, in business news, the social media company Twitter has reported a net fiscal loss of $1.14 billion in 2020. This compares to a 2019 net income of $1.47 billion. That's about $2.5 billion over that difference between the 2 years. I wonder where that comes from. Might have to do with the wave of mass suppression on the platform. Twitter said that for the first quarter of 2021, it expects total revenue to be between $940 million and $1.04 billion. And with that, we're over on time. Those were our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And when we come back, we will be joined by Dr. Wilmer Leon talking about the impeachment, Trump, and more. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also join in on the conversation with a chat, a tweet, and of course, by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Me, have been the person who have been very decidedly clear, the last man on the wall on this very specific point, that Donald Trump, Lord knows, Donald Trump should be impeached. Rashid Tlaib says she told her kid, baby, I'm going to impeach the MF. And yes, she did it. Not just once, she did it twice, something that we haven't necessarily seen before. The first one was utterly ridiculous, but this one is, I would argue, correct. It is a weird thing to me that the American public is shocked that the president, screaming at the height of his lungs that he was cheated, to 50 million people, that a percentage of bitter enders would show up at the Capitol very angry because people are totally cool about being cheated. Axe burners who today will lose it if you bring up that election between Clinton. It doesn't go down well. I am telling you this. And the conciliatory speech of the candidate, of the losing candidate, I have argued on this show is one of the most important aspects of our politics, even though it is understated. Right here, Senator Stephen Douglas told Abraham Lincoln, who he had just defeated for the presidency, partisan feelings must yield to patriotism. I am with you, Mr. President, and God bless you. Or for that matter, John Wayne. I didn't vote for him, but you're my president, and I hope he does well. When Joe Biden won, I didn't vote for him, but what did I say? He's my president. I hope he does well. Well, that's not what took place this time around. We had a president that did everything in his power in the open to overturn these election results and to get various people to do illegal things in pursuit of that. And for that, he is being impeached for inciting an insurrection. And I, for one, agree with it. Joining us to have this conversation, and I don't know where Dr. Wilmer Leon falls on this. Everybody else has been against me on this, so maybe I might have an ally. Dr. William Leon is a political scientist, nationally syndicated columnist, and host of The Critical Hour, which airs on Radio Sputnik Monday through Friday from 6 to 7 p.m. And he airs that with Garland Nixon, another Sputnik analyst who we've had to talk about this conversation. Dr. Wilmer Leon, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I don't know why you called me, because you're absolutely right. And
I get somebody who agrees. Thank you. Thank you.
Come on, man.
I've been fighting this fight. Oh, please
if 1 + 1 equals 2, then, which I think my good Catholic school mathematics teaching tells me, then look, when the commander-in-chief of any country calls for insurrection against his government or her government, then they need to be held accountable. It's just that simple.
Finally.
Everything else, all the other conversation, all the peripheral conversation about making him a martyr, this is going to subject the Democrats to the same treatment.
Free speech. That's the other one that keeps coming up. Free speech.
Okay.
Let me just point something out real quick.
Not all speech is protected speech.
And one more thing, just to make a point. It's an insult.
Not all speech is protected speech.
And just to make a point real quick.
The President of the United States is held to a different standard because he has what's called the bully pulpit. His speech resonates more than anybody else's voice in the world. So he is held to a higher, different standard, period, full stop.
Also,
what's your next?
Also, we need to point something out too. It is insulting to the intelligence of the American people. When you first start off saying, I've been cheated, fair enough, you can do that. And we supported him for it. Get your lawsuits. Go about seeing if there's fraud or anything else, because if Donald Trump is right, this is the biggest crime in the history of crimes, at least from the standpoint of our political space. But the moment that your argument devolves to the ghost of Hugo Chavez is working with the communists, and the CIA, because of course the communists can't really build a technical system that could do those things, and Governor Kemp, then you've lost me. And not just lost me, you've insulted the intelligence of the American public that should know better. Meaning, if the president is saying that, if the president is stupid enough to believe that, he earns the impeachment because he shouldn't believe that. There should be a bar of lowest common denominator of intelligence to know that this is ludicrous. And if you're still screaming that, then there is something greatly problematic about that. When you have nothing to show for it, it makes it that much worse. Please, Dr. Leon, continue.
Let me unpack that a little bit, because I don't believe when the president and when those insurrectionists are saying that the election was stolen, they're not making the same claim that we made in 2000 with Bush v. Gore. They're not making the same claim that we made in 2012 with Detroit and with Michigan and Pennsylvania with voter suppression. That's not their argument. When Donald Trump says the election was stolen, and when those insurrectionists say the election was stolen, what they're saying is black people voted en masse and we got outvoted. That's what they're saying. And so he's wrong in calling it a steal, but that's what they're really talking about.
I haven't heard that. First of all, Dr. Leon, thank you so much for joining us. And Jamarl is right. I too am relieved to have some pushback on this. Finally, I've started to get a little bit. I don't want to be like, I've never liked being in the dominant party. I've never liked feeling like I'm teaming up on somebody. And so far, 2-1, every one of our callers, every one of our guests has been pushing back on Jamarl for this. So this is like a breath of fresh air for both of us. Thank you for being willing to have this conversation. And the name of the show is Fault Lines. It has been positively magmatic. We have been fiery over this issue. We've been on fire too, debating it. So again, thank you for joining us to have this conversation. On that specific point, there are all these different ways I could push back, but I'll start with that last one because that's the first time that I've heard somebody, at least on this show, make that argument. I haven't heard Trump or his supporters make this about black voters once.
No, that's why I said it's code language.
Well, where's the code?
When they're saying the election is stolen, they're not talking voting machines. See, here's the thing. If they were truly interested in talking about free and fair elections, then they would be also talking about voter suppression, because that's documentable. That's documented. We have nothing but proof to support that argument. They're leaving out that element because that's not their intent.
But they were literally making the case that their whole argument, which in my opinion is bogus.
That's why it's called code language, Shane.
Well, but can't they just be fools? I mean, isn't it the case that our politicians are regularly fools?
They're fools. Most racists are fools.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but again, I wouldn't go from A to B in this case. Sure, Trump has a history of racism, but you got to talk about the specifics in these cases. And when it comes to specifics, all that Trump and his party, but all that Trump and his cohort in this one, all that he and his base have made an issue of, most of it at least, has been the voting machines. It's been this allegation that this Dominion voting company had corrupt machines that they were controlling. That argument
came into the game late. Rudy Giuliani is the one that injected that ignorant rhetoric into the conversation. He pulled that one out of his butt. I mean, that was just stupidity compounded by stupidity. Look at when that argument got injected into the conversation. Very late in the game. These folks got outplayed, and particularly in Georgia. They got outflanked. They never thought that they would lose one, let alone two Senate seats to what?
If they were listening to this channel, Dr. Leon, they would have known, because I said exactly what was going to take place. I did, by the way. It was straightforward to me. It's very clear, just like this is very clear to me.
That's why they're... Jamarl, am I wrong?
I don't think you're wrong. Well, I kind of agree and kind of disagree. Because I kind of agree with Shane that I don't know if these people care one way or the other about black voters.
Okay, here's the
what I
here's
think
the
they care
compromise.
about is
Here's
power
the
and winning.
compromise, Shane. The compromise is it's an element of their argument.
That's fair.
It's not their entire argument. It's an element of their argument. How about that?
How can it be an element of their argument if they haven't made it? I mean, I guess
Because they're
this isn't
speaking
even
in code language.
Well, but how do we interpret that? Here's the thing: can't our government use that same argument to read into the tea leaves of anybody's speech to get whatever they want said out of the discourse, to push out whatever speech they don't like? Isn't that like this whole thing about dog whistling and coded language over the last couple of years? I get that totally happens sometimes. I don't want to seriously push back on the idea that exists. That does happen. Other like these things about gaslighting. But what we're doing by making that argument, in my opinion, is ceding the power to our authorities, to giving them legal authority in some cases to try to interpret our speech for us, to restrict us from saying certain things, whatever it is. What happens is, all of a sudden, people pushing back on the government of Israel is coded language for them being anti-Semites across the board, or people pushing back on the Democrats for their negligence and for not doing nearly enough for anybody in our country becomes racism against black people or whatever. It's just these different ways to give protections to groups you like and to permanently disqualify from speech groups you don't like. Isn't that where that leads? We gotta come back.
I don't care where it leads. It is what it is. I don't care where it leads. When Donald Trump says we love you, when Donald Trump says stand down but stand by, that's code language. That's code language.
I wouldn't even say that's coded. That in my opinion,
that's coded. That's pretty straightforward.
I know you got to go. I know you got to go to a break, so I'll stand down but stand by.
Thank you for that. We're joined by Dr. Wilmer Leon. He is the co-host now of the Critical Hour. That's a show that airs on Radio Sputnik Monday through Friday from 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern. He's also a political scientist and a nationally syndicated columnist, and he is joining us for a wonderful conversation about Trump's impeachment, coded language, a lot more, I'm sure, on the other side of this break. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we'll be back with Dr. Leon in just a minute.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We have had a fiery and a great combo with our guest, Dr. Wilmer Leon, political scientist, nationally syndicated columnist, and host of the Critical Hour, which airs on Radio Sputnik Monday through Friday from 6 to 7 p.m. This is a fascinating conversation to me.
Wait, and real quick, I'm sorry for this. It is now 6 to 8 too, right? Because it's the Critical Hour, but there's also the Critical Hour extended. Is that right, Dr. Leon?
Every day, Monday through Friday. Correct.
Oh, excellent. And that's right.
6
with
to 8
co-host
p.m.
Garland, Garland
Correct.
Nixon. Look, it's funny when you ask me about whether whether it was coded. I'm wishy-washy on the answer because the answer is a little bit of both. There is dog whistles in politics. That's something that goes on. That's something African Americans are perfectly clear on. When the conversation came up, I think it was in Florida, and they made the gorilla joke, and people were like, "What? I don't see the big deal." It was coded. He didn't have to use that word. That word was used for that very specific emphasis on what that word meant. And so that's fair enough. I think my issue is that I don't think that's the strongest aspect of the argument for impeachment, because the other stuff is just so glaringly obvious, right? For example,
I didn't say it was.
Well, let's go to some of the clips, because I want you to see and hear some of the stuff that was taking place. Now, the impeachment manager basically played this when they first started. So let's play the very first clip. And these get progressively worse. I had to basically carve out the clips because of the cursing, because of the racism that's in it, them screaming N-words at some of the officers, the beatings, and all this other stuff. Is violent content. But let's play the first clip. Okay, maybe we don't have that first clip.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe we don't have
Well,
it.
Maybe we don't have that first clip.
Let me say this, if I can, real quick.
Go for it.
This is how I know that Donald Trump's language, well, two things. One, a lot of people make the mistake of just listening to the January 6th speech and say, oh, well, he didn't say anything on January 6th. That was never the premise of the House managers. The premise of the House managers is it's been an ongoing dialogue since the Michigan attack on the Michigan state capitol. It's been at least a month of rhetoric and diatribe that Donald Trump has been engaged in. It's not just the 6th of January. That's the first point. And the other point is that, again, the way that you know that he incited those insurrectionists to attack the Capitol is the insurrectionists themselves tell you that. We are here because he sent us. We are in here waiting for him to tell us what to do.
Yeah.
We are here because he told us. That's all you need to know.
And they're screaming Trump. They're screaming stop the steal. Like you said, they're screaming we're here for Trump.
Yeah.
And there's something else that people need to realize. And that is, I would argue, worse, maybe even the worst aspect of it. Mike Pence stood by Trump the entire time. That was his ace coon. That was his boy. Pence would not say a bad word about Trump, even when Trump was screaming this nonsense about the communists raising Hugo Chavez from the dead to steal the election. Pence did his due diligence and kept his mouth shut because that was the strongest position he could take. When it became clear that Pence was in danger, which his report came out last night, Trump knew that Pence's potential was in danger. And he goes out and continues to attack Pence, riving up that crowd that much more so. There's part of the video footage here where people are screaming, we're looking for Pence. Where's Pence? Where's Pence? And Donald Trump is tweeting, Pence is a coward. And Pence is doing this and Pence is doing that while he knew Pence was in danger. That was
they erected the gallows and they were screaming, hang Pence. Now, first of all, Pence sold his soul to the devil. There's no question about it.
But Pence stood by him. And my point was, he could have knifed Pence in a heartbeat.
I would never want to see Mike Pence dragged out of the Capitol and hung. I'm not that kind of. I was raised better than that. I'm not that kind of guy. Maybe drag him down the steps and beat him up a little bit. I'm just kidding. But you never want to see your vice president, no matter who he is, no matter how noxious he is, you would never want to see violence become the vice president of any country. You don't want to see that. But that's what was incited here. And again, folks, we know that Donald Trump did it because the people that engaged in the insurrection told you they were taking their direction from him. That's direct nexus. That's direct connection. That you don't need any more than that. Oh, and here's the other point.
Well, yes, but no, but yes, you do.
But here's Mitch McConnell said he did. So if Mitch McConnell says it, we know it must be true.
I don't know about that one either. But I mean, okay, so I want to come back to something you were saying earlier. You were talking about how Trump had been engaging in rhetoric and diatribes for months. Isn't that what small d democratic politics is defined by? Is politicians engaging in rhetoric and diatribes against their opponents? I mean, increasingly so these days for sure. But if you look at the history of pretty much any democracy around the world, that is like the default go-to. Other than lying to the public, other than lying to their constituents about what they're going to deliver on them. That is the nature of politics. And here's my point. Are we going to make that illegal? What specifically did Trump say that was illegal? Because if he can't point to a specific statement, then again, what you're giving is this broad halo to the government, this broad ability and authority to the government to suppress political speech they don't like, which will come back to bite us the hardest. It will come back to bite anybody who seriously tries to stand up to the government the most. I see Biden pushing on this. He said it's one of his top priorities.
When Donald Trump says at a rally, go ahead. When Donald Trump incites violence at a rally by telling people, go ahead and beat them up. Go ahead, I'll pay your legal fees. Go ahead and beat them up. When after a violent attack in Charlottesville, Trump tries to extol the virtues of the neo-Nazis and the skinheads. When you have violence in Michigan.
Those are years ago and unrelated cases, and he is not being charged on those.
I am showing a pattern of behavior. Past acts in this instance can be brought in to show a pattern of behavior. And this is what the man has done, well, since he's been in office, but you can just look at his tweets and his texts over a 2-month period. It's like smoking at the gas station.
All right. We have a clip.
That is a great analogy. I love that analogy.
I chuckled at that too. I thought that was good. We've got a clip here. Andre, let's go to this clip from the Senate impeachment hearings of the events on January 6th. Let's play this clip.
The Constitution says you have to protect our country and you have to protect our Constitution. And you can't vote on fraud. And fraud breaks up everything, doesn't it? When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do. Talk about you, We fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Light that cigarette. Stand by the car while you're pumping gas. See what happens to you.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we have another one with Pence. I don't know if we have that one. Can we play that one where the guys are screaming that Pence has committed treason? That clip also. And just to make a point about this, of what you're saying, Dr. Wilmer, they did not have permission to do what they did. So Greg Palast came out, and Greg Palast makes the point the Park Service reiterated days before the Trump rally to permit does not authorize a march from the eclipse. As an insider who planned the rally told us, sponsor Women from America First was stunned by Trump's seemingly spontaneous call for a march in violation of the permit. Quote, "It was shocking. It's something we advocated against doing for the exact reason that it ended up playing out themselves. In other words, the riot was foreseeable and resulted directly from Trump's call to march. As the permit holders understood, sending thousands of angry people, some armed, meant that there was no warning to the Metro or Capitol Police, no monitors, no direct control of the crowd." Let's play the clip if we have it, please.
Defend your Constitution! Defend your liberty! Defend your Constitution!
By the way, at this point, they were in the Capitol. When they were screaming about Pence, Trump was tweeting about Pence. They were following, basically, what he was saying. Again, reiterate. They weren't even supposed to be able to do that. When Trump is like, we're going to march, they weren't supposed to be able to march anywhere. Trump is guilty of sin. Dr. Leon, please, what do you think about
this country?
Please, continue, just give your words, your pass. We have about a minute and a half on this, unless you would like to stay for the last 15 minutes for calls, which will probably be very interesting. You're more than welcome to stay.
In this country, what is the penalty for treason? Death. If you are convicted of treason in the United States, the the ultimate punishment for treason is death. That's what these people were calling for. That's why they erected the gallows on the ellipse. That's why they were looking for Mike Pence. That's why they were trying to drag him out of the Capitol, because they wanted to kill him. And who was inciting them? The president. When you smoke at the gas station, it's not the gasoline, it's not the liquid gasoline that ignites, it's the fumes from the tank. And Donald Trump was providing the fumes. He was smoking and playing to the fumes from the tank.
Oh, this is going to be a great conversation. We need to go into a break. It's about time. But Wilmer, just real quick, would you be willing to stay with us for this last segment?
For you, Shane, of course.
Thank you so much. And
this is going to be awesome.
It will be. This last one is the last segment we're going to, the last segment of this show and this week. We're taking a bunch of calls, 202-521-1320. I see we have some callers already on the line ready to join us. We are joined by Dr. Wilmer Leon. He is the host and co-host of the Critical Hour and the Critical Hour Extended. That show airs on Radio Sputnik from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday, and he is the co-host of it, along with Garland Nixon. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back taking your calls, getting more into this conversation on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are still joined by our guest, Dr. Wilmer Leon. He's the host and co-host of the Critical Hour and the Critical Hour Extended. That's a show airing here on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, co-hosted with Garland Nixon, former host of the previous incarnation of this show and a frequent guest on Fault Lines. Dr. Leon, thank you for staying with us. And we're taking calls in this segment, talking about Trump, the impeachment, whether it's justified or not, all this stuff. 202-521-1320. We've got Stedman calling in from Detroit. Stedman, you're on the line. What's on your mind? Stedman, you there? I cannot hear you.
Hello? Sorry. Yep, I'm here.
There we go. We got you on. Stedman, what do you have to say?
So this might sound a little mean. I hope it's not mean, but it seems like Dr. Leon is working on getting an MSNBC or CNN contract.
Oh, that's wrong.
What talking about?
That's so wrong. That's so wrong.
Mainstream media talking points. So to get back on what I wanted to talk about yesterday. So we have evidence of an FBI lawyer changing documents, right, to try to get the Trump campaign. We've got evidence of the FBI lying to the FISA courts. We got evidence of the FBI lying when they came to talk to Flynn. We got evidence of the media apparatus working together with the Democratic Party, mainstream Republicans, to try to delegitimize Trump's presidency throughout the process, right? The DOJ drops charges against Michael Flynn. The judge doesn't do anything about it. He won't drop charges, right? The DOJ says, hey, we want this Klein-Smith. We want him to face at least 10 years. That's our recommendation. He's facing a couple $100 fines. And so to get onto what Jamal was talking about, a tit for tat, and how even human beings are justified in that. Why should Trump care about whatever the mainstream media talking point is, whatever the mainstream media ideology is, when he's been attacked and undermined for 4 straight years. And I'm not a Trump supporter. But I'm looking at this from the issues of free speech. You talk about tit for tat. What this also expresses is Jamal's attachment to the symbols of empire. So Jamal wants to be anti-establishment and pro-establishment at the same time. And here's what I mean by that.
No, wait.
So you have a situation.
Stedman, real quick. Stedman, I am perfectly okay if the government goes down in a ball of fire where it's a free-for-all. I am not okay in handing it off to a
I don't like that.
I am not. It's not something that I love per se, that I wanted to go all down in a ball of fire. But between those two things of handing it off to a fascist as opposed to a free-for-all where people are trying to, pull the government in a particular direction. No, I am not for that. He is turning over. Look, I agree with you that they tried to delegitimize Trump the entire way through. Perfectly agree with you. In fact, we've pit that on this channel the entire way through. When they went to impeach Trump the first time around, what did I say? This is horrendous. Joe Biden did this. This is theater. They're full of it. By the same token, I am perfectly clear in my assessment that Donald Trump was trying to turn over the game board. He tried to turn it over. He wanted to become God King. And whether that's sending military, they were talking about sending military down to Georgia to get voting machines, talking about declaring martial law. Just because Trump is incompetent and was doing this stuff in the open doesn't make it any less of a putsch tip. And so, yeah, I have no problem with that. And it's not trying to work for MSNBC. It's an assertion of reality. Politics and politicians have these political wars. They can do that. That's part of the mix. But it's a different thing when you go beyond the political war and try to literally just take it all. That's different. That's different.
A couple of quick points to Stedman. First of all, that is trying to invalidate my position by childishly saying, "Oh, that's an MSNBC talking point." That's that schoolyard anti-intellectual foolishness. I'd say something else, but
it's an ad hominem attack that tries to undermine your position before you even lets you make your point. That's exactly what that is. You should be a better person than that, Stedman. You should be ashamed of yourself, Stedman.
That ignorant statement. But because his name is Stedman, he must be whipped by Oprah. That's just stupidity. And also, if he knew anything about me, he would know there are reasons why I was and am no longer on MSNBC. It's because I refuse to parrot their talking points. And the same thing with CNN. So Stedman, spend a little more time reading, spend a little more time thinking, and then come back and talk to me.
Will, from the chat.
Dr. Leon, it is a furnace in here. I gave you advance notice. It's been like this around this issue.
We got more callers. I ain't worried about that foolishness. Come on now.
All right. Thank you for being with us. Let's go to Whale, calling in from the chat. Whale, you're on. What's going on?
Hey. So recently, Times made an article titled Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election. So Jimmy Dore recently did a talk with Max Blumenfeld on his youth channel. So in the article, it goes into how so this is directly from the article. It says, to the president, something felt amiss. It was very, very strange. Within days of the election, we witnessed an organized effort to anoint the winner, even while many key states were still being counted. And then later on, it says here, a conspiracy was unfolding behind the scenes, one that curtailed the protests and coordinated effort to visit residents from the CEOs.
Well, wait. Well, just tell us your point. Just tell us what you want to get to.
What's the point?
Just tell us the point.
You can't respond like that, man. What's the point of the article?
Let me talk.
We only got 8 minutes.
Yeah, dude, we are on the radio show, Will. This is not, this is not like some random thing. We're on radio. We just need you to give us the very specific point that you were trying to make. That's all. Nobody's trying to stop you from talking.
Okay. All right. So there were very aspects of the election. They got states to change voting systems, laws, and help secure hundreds of millions in public and private funding. They fended off voter suppression lawsuits, recruited armies of poll workers and millions of people who vote by mail for the first time. They successfully pressured social media companies to take part of line against disinformation and data-driven strategy to fight viral smears. They executed national public awareness campaigns that helped.
I think I know what you're saying. You're basically arguing that it says, look, there were laws that were changed that basically allowed new measures. So let's say people by voting by mail and everything else, and that in and of itself constituted some kind of illegality associated with it. Look, Donald Trump, if he would have said and let people wear masks, if he would have focused on ensuring that the public was safe and everything else, by election time, they wouldn't have had the political capital to try to push through mail-in voting. I hope you get my point. He basically stabbed himself because he was so concerned about the economy and so unempathetic to deal with the real material concerns of the public. When you have 400,000 people dying, yeah, the Democrats can say, hey, we need to vote by mail. And you know what? Under normal circumstances, Democrats, the more people that tend to vote, those people tend to vote Democrat. I mean, it's for understood. In Republican policy, it's the reason why they undermine the vote totals. It's the reason why they put through these voter ID laws and everything else. The less number of people to vote. What do you say? We don't want everybody to vote. We want people to vote basically who's going to vote for us. The ones that don't, nope, we don't want those. Elections aren't about everybody voting. Elections about getting people to the polls who vote for you. That's understood. What is the guy named Whedon?
The president said that himself.
Yeah, that's a Republican dogma. And so
said that himself.
Expanding the vote tally at that point hurts them. It's the reason why Donald Trump was attacking the mail service, the post office. It's the reason why they were attacking mail, and they tried to destroy it to make sure that the people couldn't get in voter tally. Yeah, that's exactly why they were doing those things. Dr. Leon, please continue.
Well, the president said himself that he was doing this because the more people that turn out, the less chance the Republicans have to win. He said that himself. And there's nothing in any of those actions that were taken, not a thing that in any of those actions that was taken that promulgated or promoted illegal voting. You want a larger electorate. You want as many people in your country that are legally registered to vote. You want that. I would ask the caller to show me any evidence that supports the claim that there was voter fraud. Because
that's what I would want to see too. That's what I would want to see too. I would want to see it and say specifically, frankly, hundreds of millions of people voting here. There's going to be fraud. But the argument has been, is it enough to have swung it in Biden's favor? Because
no, Shane.
That's the crucial point.
No, Shane, that's not right. What they have said is that, yes, there are mistakes that are made. And they have also said that in the instances where there has been fraud, it is insignificant. And they have also said
that's been what we've been saying on the show. That's the thing that we've been saying on the show effectively.
One more point, Shane. Voter fraud is a felony. How many cases have been tried?
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, when they put through those voter ID laws to basically stop that 0-something%, they get rid of hundreds of thousands of voters. When you had Al Gore versus Bush, and you had all of those African Americans, hundreds of thousands of African Americans that couldn't vote in that election, and those Democrats would stand up and say, we were disenfranchised, and Gore gavelled each and every one of them down. Like you said, this stuff is a felony. Those things would have been prosecuted. And look, it was open, and Donald Trump didn't just say he barely won. He said he won in a landslide.
Statistically insignificant.
Yes.
We got one more caller. There's a lot to talk about here, but we only have so much time. Let's go to Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. The trial going on with Trump is more than just about Trump. It's about attacking the narrative. It's about freedom of speech and how it parallels with the Julian Assange trial. How they're trying to go against him for him saying that he was pushing Chelsea Manning into giving him more documents, and how it's going to be used to go after everybody else dealing with Medicaid for all and all the protesters on the street. If some provocateur pick up a brick like Gordon Nixon said yesterday and throw it and go off and hit a law enforcement agent, then the whole group can get in trouble. And people don't have money for lawyers. We all know that they got these mega people that was at the Capitol having trouble finding lawyers now. So right now we're in a slippery slope where the freedom of speech is actually under attack. Trump meant to say this. No, he meant to say that. Is it incitement? Is it not incitement? But if they go after him, then they go after everybody.
Can I ask you a question? Tarif, can I ask you a question? The President of the United States, with the bully pulpit at his disposal. Okay, yeah, we only have one. So
we're running out of time, though.
Yeah, we're running out of time.
You can't.
We pretty much are out of time. Yeah. Wilmer Leon, thank you for joining us for this conversation.
My
close you out for those listening. That was the voice of Dr. Wilmer Leon. He is the host and co-host of the Critical Hour and the Critical Hour Extended. That's a show airing here on Radio Sputnik Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. Thanks again for being willing to stick with us through all three of those segments. And we got to close this week out, too. Quick reminder, we're not going to be on the air, folks, on Monday. It is President's Day. We're off that day. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, everybody who called in and was a guest on the show. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas, for hosting the show with me. We'll be back on Tuesday, folks, signing off Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
That is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. Another feisty show. Love those. So that was a really good show. I love that. We've turned over a new leaf on this show, new channel. We've become far more feistier and I don't want to say acerbic, but definitely far more feistier of a show. But look, I want to thank all of you. We're still trying to get everything worked out. But look, we're off on Monday. You probably will see me a little bit later today, whether it's on here or Rockfin. And I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks all. Bye-bye.